Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. This also keeps you updated with new episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I'm still trying to make sense of everything that happened. It's hard to put it into words because I'm not even sure I understand it myself. But I need to get it out, I guess. Maybe someone else will see this and have some idea of what went wrong. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Me and my best friend, Emily, had planned it for months. We both loved hiking, and the cabin was perfect, secluded, surrounded by woods, no cell service. We wanted to disconnect from everything. We'd been friends for years, and this was something we always did. A tradition, I guess you could say. The cabin was about a 5-hour drive from the city. We arrived late in the afternoon, got settled in, and spent the evening going over our hiking plans. We had a route mapped out, just a few hours hike through the trails, and we'd come back to the cabin to relax. The first day went perfectly. The weather was great, the trails were easy, and everything felt peaceful. It was the second day when things went wrong. We woke up early, excited to tackle a longer trail that went deeper into the woods. It was marked on the map, but we hadn't tried it before. Emily was more adventurous than me, always pushing us to go further or try something new. I trusted her judgment, she was good with directions, and I never worry about getting lost with her. The trail started off fine. We were walking for maybe 2 hours, talking and laughing, when Emily decided she wanted to go off trail to explore a bit. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I went along. She always did this, and it never caused any issues before. We walked off the path, through thick trees and uneven ground. I started to feel uneasy. The woods were dense, and it felt like we were farther from the trail than I wanted to be. Emily kept moving ahead, calling out how amazing everything looked, how we should keep going. At some point, I lost sight of her. I was looking down at my feet, trying not to trip over roots, and when I looked up, she wasn't there. I called out her name, expecting her to respond with some joke about how slow I was. But she didn't answer. I called her name again, louder this time. Nothing. Just the sound of the wind in the trees. I wasn't panicking yet. I thought she must have just gone ahead a little too far, and I'd catch up. I started walking faster, shouting her name, but every time I stopped to listen, all I heard was the quiet of the woods. It was too quiet. No birds, no animals, just the trees and the wind. After what felt like forever, I realized I was completely alone. I turned around, thinking maybe she'd circle back without me noticing, but the way back looked different. I couldn't tell where the trail was anymore. Everything looked the same. That's when the panic started to set in. I kept calling for her, louder and louder, my voice echoing through the trees. I tried to retrace my steps, but I must have gotten turned around somewhere. Nothing looked familiar anymore. I kept walking, hoping to find the trail, but every direction felt like it was leading me deeper into the woods. Hours passed. My legs were sore, my throat was dry from shouting, and I still hadn't seen any sign of Emily. I started thinking about what to do, stay put or keep moving. I didn't have my phone with me since we knew there was no service, and even if I had it, it wouldn't help out here. I felt stupid for not being more cautious, for not insisting we stick to the trail. As the sun started to set, I knew I needed to get back to the cabin. Emily had to be there by now, probably wondering where I was. Maybe she had made it back before me and was waiting, worried. That's what I told myself as I finally found my way back to what I thought was the main trail. I was wrong. The trail I found wasn't the one we had started on. It was narrower, overgrown, and led me in a direction I didn't recognize. I followed it anyway, figuring any path was better than none. But it didn't take me back to the cabin. It just kept winding deeper into the woods, and the light was fading fast. By the time I realized I was completely lost, it was almost dark. My mind was racing, thinking of all the stupid survival tricks I'd heard over the years: stay put, find shelter, wait for help. But I couldn't stay out there. I had to find Emily. I had to get back to the cabin. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, I saw it, just a flicker of light through the trees. I almost cried in relief. The cabin. I stumbled toward it, my legs shaking from exhaustion. I ran up the steps and yanked open the door, expecting to see Emily sitting inside, maybe annoyed that I had taken so long. But the cabin was empty. Everything was exactly how we had left it that morning. Her backpack was still by the door, her jacket hanging on the hook. But she wasn't there. My heart sank. I stood in the doorway, staring at the empty cabin, trying to figure out what to do. And that's when I saw it. Her phone. It was sitting on the porch, right where I would have seen it when we left that morning. I hadn't noticed it when I first came up because I was so focused on getting inside. I picked it up, confused. She never went anywhere without her phone, even if there was no service. The screen lit up when I touched it, and I saw a string of messages she had apparently sent to me. But I never got them. My phone was inside, in my bag, and there was no way either of us had a signal out here. I scrolled through the texts, my heart pounding. They started off normal enough. She'd sent a couple of pictures of the trail earlier in the day, followed by, "You okay? Where'd you go?" But then they got stranger. "Seriously, where are you? I'm freaking out. Answer me. Someone's out here." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the last few messages. "I see him. He's watching me. He's getting closer. Please come back." That was the last one. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. It didn't make any sense. Emily never sent those messages. We had been together the whole time, and there was no one else out there. No one had been following us. At least, I hadn't seen anyone. But the messages were real. They were on her phone, right there in front of me. I ran inside the cabin and grabbed my own phone, praying for a signal, but there was nothing. No service. I checked my bag to see if I had missed any messages, but there was nothing from Emily. Nothing from anyone. I was completely cut off. I didn't know what to do. I paced around the cabin, checking the windows, locking the door, trying to make sense of what had happened. My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. Had someone really been following us? Was Emily still out there somewhere, lost and scared? I waited for hours, hoping she would come back. But she never did. As the night wore on, I kept hearing noises outside. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, footsteps. Every time I looked out the window, there was nothing there, just a dark outline of the trees. But I knew someone was out there. I could feel it. At one point, I thought I saw movement, just a shadow passing between the trees, too quick to get a good look. My heart raced as I stared out into the darkness, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But then, there was a knock at the door. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there. I froze, my blood running cold. No one should have been out there. Emily was still missing, and there was no one else for miles. I crept toward the door, my hands trembling. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I didn't open it. Instead, I backed away, keeping my eyes on the door, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The knocking stopped, and the cabin was silent again. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching a kitchen knife I had found in one of the drawers. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every little sound made me jump, convinced that someone was outside, watching, waiting. By morning, there was still no sign of Emily. I packed up my things and left the cabin as fast as I could. I didn't care about leaving anything behind. I just needed to get out of there. I called the authorities as soon as I had a signal, but they never found her. They searched the woods, questioned me, and went over everything, but there was no trace of Emily. It was like she had disappeared without a trace. And I still don't know who or what sent those messages. I've been going back and forth about whether to share this, but I can't stop thinking about it. I don't know if writing it down will help, but here it goes. I was on a solo road trip, driving through the desert, just to clear my head and get away for a few days. I'd been driving for hours, just this long stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. It was getting late in the afternoon, and the heat was still intense. You could see the waves rising off the pavement. I was running low on gas, and I hadn't seen a station for miles. Finally, I spotted this small, beat-up gas station in the distance. It looked like something out of a movie, dusty, faded signs, barely any cars around. The place looked deserted, but the pump lights were on, so I pulled in. I got out of the car and stretched. The place felt eerie, like it had been stuck in time. The wind kicked up dust, and everything was so quiet. I didn't see anyone inside the little shop at first, but I figured I'd pay after I filled up. I grabbed the nozzle and started pumping gas, trying not to think too much about how empty the whole place felt. That's when I heard it. This sound, like shuffling footsteps coming up behind me. I turned around, and there was this guy. He looked rough, clothes torn, dirt smudged all over his face, hair wild and unkempt. His eyes were wide, like he hadn't slept in days, and he was breathing hard. I instinctively stepped back, not sure what his deal was, but before I could say anything, he started talking. "Please," he said, his voice shaky. "You have to help me." I was still holding the gas pump, staring at him. "What's going on?" I asked. He kept looking around, like he was expecting someone to jump out of the shadows at any moment. "They're coming," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I got away, but they'll be here soon. I didn't know what to make of it. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Was he high? Was this some kind of setup? But there was something about the way he was shaking, the look in his eyes. It wasn't fake. He was terrified. "Who's coming?" I asked, glancing around the lot. There was no one else in sight, just the endless stretch of road behind us. "They took me," he said, his voice cracking. "Weeks ago. I don't know where I was, but I got out. Please, you have to help me." I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what he was saying. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days, his skin pale and gaunt. And his eyes, they were desperate, pleading. I didn't know what to do. My brain was screaming at me to get in the car and drive, but something held me back. "What do you mean, they took you?" I asked, still trying to process. He grabbed my arm, and I flinched. "Please, just let me get in your car. We need to go now. They'll be here any minute." I pulled my arm away, and my heart started racing. I didn't know this guy, didn't know if I could trust him. But before I could make up my mind, I heard the sound of an engine approaching. I looked up and saw a truck pulling into the gas station. It was old, rusted, and had two men sitting in the front. They slowed down as they got closer, and the guy standing with me went white as a sheet. His whole body stiffened. "It's them," he whispered. "We have to go. Now." The truck stopped about 20 feet away from us, and the two men just sat there, staring. They didn't get out, didn't say anything. Just watched. My heart was pounding in my chest. Everything in me was telling me to run, to get in the car and drive, but I couldn't move. The guy grabbed my arm again, harder this time. "Please, he begged, his voice breaking. "They're going to take me back." The two men finally got out of the truck. They weren't in any hurry. One of them was tall, built like a brick wall, wearing a dirty baseball cap pulled low over his face. The other was shorter, scruffy, with a thick beard. They looked at me first, then at the guy, and I could feel the tension in the air. "Hey," the taller one called out, his voice calm, almost casual. "You all right there, buddy?" The guy next to me squeezed my arm tighter, his eyes darting between them and my car. "Don't listen to them," he said, his voice trembling. "They're lying. They're the ones who took me." The two men started walking toward us, slow and deliberate. "Why don't you come with us?" the tall one said. "We've been looking for you. We'll get you some help." I felt like I was in a nightmare. I couldn't tell what was real, who was telling the truth. Was this guy really a victim, or was this some kind of twisted game? My mind was spinning, trying to figure out what to do. The shorter man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Come on," he said, his voice low. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." The guy next to me was shaking so hard, I thought he might collapse. "Please," he whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Don't let them take me." I had to make a choice, and I didn't have time to think. My instinct was screaming at me to protect myself, to get the hell out of there. But something about the way the guy was holding on to me, the fear in his eyes, it felt real. I yanked my arm away from him and took a step back. "I don't know what's going on," I said, my voice shaking. "But I'm not getting involved." The guy's face crumpled, like I just sealed his fate. He took a step toward me, but the two men were faster. The tall one grabbed him by the arm, pulling him away from me, while the shorter one watched me closely, like he was making sure I didn't try to interfere. "Don't worry," the tall man said, his voice smooth. "We've got this under control." The guy started screaming, thrashing against the tall man's grip, but he didn't stand a chance. They dragged him back toward the truck, and I just stood there, frozen, watching it happen. As they shoved him into the back of the truck, he looked at me one last time, his eyes wide with terror. "Please," he cried out. "Please help me." The door slammed shut, and the two men climbed back into the cab. The engine roared to life, and within seconds, they were driving away, kicking up dust as they sped off down the highway. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the empty road, my mind numb. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? What if I was wrong? What if he was just some crazy guy, and those men were trying to help him? But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined the fear in his voice. I knew something was wrong. I got back in my car, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that gas station. I didn't want to think about what had just happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made the wrong choice. I keep replaying it in my head, the way he looked at me, the way those men moved so calmly, like they knew they were in control the whole time. I don't know what they were going to do to him, but I can't stop thinking about it. I was out on my own, like I had done 100 times before. I've been hiking since I was a kid, so the idea of going solo into the wilderness didn't bother me. It's peaceful, and I've always liked the quiet. That's why I headed out to the trail near the old mountain range, miles away from the nearest town. Not many people go that far out, and that's exactly how I like it. I wanted to clear my head, spend a couple days by myself, then head back down. Simple. I'd been walking for hours when I first saw them, 3 people, maybe 400 feet ahead, spread out along the trail, like they were looking for something. I figured they were just hikers like me at first, but as I got closer, I saw one of them holding a flyer. When I passed by, the woman in the group called out to me. "Have you seen anyone out here? We're looking for a missing person." I stopped, pulled off my backpack, and walked over. The flyer she had was for a guy, mid-30s, who'd apparently gone missing 2 days ago. His picture was printed right there, his face staring up at me. It's strange, seeing someone who's out there somewhere, lost. It gives you a bad feeling, thinking about all the ways it could go wrong out here. I told her I hadn't seen anyone, but I'd keep an eye out. She thanked me, but the whole time, she didn't really look at me. Just kept her eyes scanning the trail like she expected to see the guy any second. The other two with her didn't say much, just nodded at me. One of them, a guy with a beard, seemed a little off. His eyes kept darting around, not at the woods or the trail, but at me. Like he was sizing me up, or trying to figure something out. It made me uneasy, but I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe he was just stressed about the missing person. I moved on, leaving them behind, and kept hiking. The air felt different after that. Not just because of what they said, something about the way the wind shifted, or maybe just my nerves. I don't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept walking, though, and tried to push it out of my mind. About an hour later, the sun was starting to set, and I realized I had gone farther than I planned. It was that time of day when the shadows stretch out long and everything looks unfamiliar. The trail I had been following wasn't as clear anymore, either. I don't know when it happened, but I must have veered off at some point because I wasn't seeing the markers anymore. Just trees and rocks, nothing that looked like the path I'd been on. I wasn't worried yet. I've been in situations like this before, and it's usually just a matter of backtracking a bit and finding your way again. So, I turned around and started heading back the way I thought I came. But after about 20 minutes, I realized I wasn't seeing anything I recognized. That's when the panic started creeping in. It's funny how quickly that happens. One minute you're calm, thinking you've got it under control, and the next, every tree starts looking the same, and the light's fading faster than you expected. I stopped for a second, trying to get my bearings, when I heard the crunch of footsteps on the ground behind me. I turned around, expecting to see one of those people from earlier, maybe the woman with the flyers. But there was no one there. Just the sound of branches swaying in the wind. I listened for a while, but it was quiet after that. Too quiet. I started walking again, faster this time, and that's when I saw it. Another flyer. Taped to a tree, just off the trail. Same guy, same missing person, but it was weird. I hadn't seen this flyer before, and I had just come from that direction. There shouldn't have been any flyers behind me. I went over to it, and something about it made my skin crawl. The paper was wet, like it had been left out in the rain, even though it hadn't rained at all. And there was something else. A note, scribbled at the bottom in red ink. Stop looking. I stood there for a minute, just staring at it, trying to figure out what that meant. Stop looking? Was this a message for the search party? Or for me? I didn't have time to think about it, though, because I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time, and faster. I turned around, heart racing, but again, there was no one there. Just the trees, the fading light, and the silence. I started walking, almost running, trying to get back to the spot where I had last seen the search party. Maybe they were still around, and I could ask them for help. But the more I walked, the more I realized I wasn't going in the right direction. Everything looked different now, like the woods were shifting around me. And then, just when I thought I couldn't get any more turned around, I saw them. The search party, or at least two of them, standing a little ways off the trail, just staring at me. They didn't wave or call out. They just stood there, side by side, watching. I waved at them, thinking maybe they hadn't seen me. But they didn't respond. They just kept standing there, not moving. My stomach dropped. Something was wrong. Really wrong. I don't know why I didn't notice it earlier, but now that I was looking at them, I realized something was off about the way they were standing. It was too still. too rigid, like they were waiting for something. I backed away slowly, not sure what to do. As soon as I took a step back, they started walking toward me. Not running, but moving with purpose, like they knew exactly where I was going to go. I turned and bolted, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care about finding the trail anymore, I just wanted to get away from them. I ran for what felt like miles, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about anything but putting distance between me and them. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I looked around. I had no idea where I was. The woods were thick, the light was almost gone, and I was completely lost. And then I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were all around me, coming from every direction. I spun around, trying to see who was there, but the trees were casting long shadows, and everything looked the same. I backed up, trying to stay calm, but the footsteps kept getting closer. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them again. The same two people from the search party, standing just inside the tree line, watching. I didn't wait this time. I ran again, harder, faster, my legs burning, lungs screaming. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were right behind me. The footsteps never stopped. By the time I saw the cabin, I was barely holding it together. I don't know how I found it, but there it was, an old ranger's cabin, abandoned but still standing. I stumbled toward it, my legs about to give out, and threw myself inside. I slammed the door behind me and collapsed against it, trying to catch my breath. For a moment, everything was quiet again. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing in the wind outside. But then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard voices. Low, murmuring voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were getting closer. And then, over the voices, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I was heading back to my hometown for the first time in a while, just passing through. It had been years since I'd seen most people there, and honestly, I wasn't planning on staying long. My parents had moved, and I didn't have any real reason to stick around. Just a quick stop to refuel, grab something to eat, then hit the road again. There was this little diner off the highway, a place I remembered from when I was a kid. My family used to stop there on our way out of town. It hadn't changed much, same neon sign, same faded booths inside. I parked, got out, and went in, hoping to get something quick before getting back on the road. I sat at the counter, ordered a sandwich and coffee, and waited. It wasn't crowded, just a couple of truckers at a table and an older couple near the back. The waitress was friendly enough, took my order with a smile, then disappeared into the kitchen. That's when I saw him. The guy behind the counter, wiping down mugs and restocking the sugar packets, looked so familiar it stopped me cold. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. I hadn't seen him in years. But no, it was definitely him, Paul. Paul went missing from our town almost a decade ago. He was in his early 20s when he vanished. People talked about it for months, wondering what had happened. He wasn't the type to just up and leave. He had a decent job, friends, a girlfriend. No reason to disappear. There were searches, flyers, the usual stuff, but eventually, it all just faded away. People stopped looking, stopped asking, and life went on. But there he was, standing a few feet away from me, as if nothing had ever happened. He looked a little older, sure, but it was him. I stared at him for a long time, trying to process what I was seeing. I almost didn't notice when my food arrived. The waitress dropped it off, but I barely touched it. I couldn't stop looking at him. Finally, I got up the nerve to say something. I waited until he was near the end of the counter, alone. I leaned over and spoke quietly. "Paul?" He looked up, his face blank, and then he smiled like I was just another customer. "Sorry, don't know anyone by that name," he said, his voice calm. "No, it's you. I know you. We're from the same town. You disappeared years ago." His smile faltered, just for a second, then he shook his head. "You must be mistaken. My name's Pete," he said, wiping down the counter like nothing was out of the ordinary. I felt a chill run through me. He was lying. I knew it. But he acted so casual, like it didn't bother him at all that I had just accused him of being someone else. "I know who you are," I insisted, my voice dropping lower. "People were looking for you. Your family." He cut me off, his face hardening. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've never been to your town. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do." He turned his back on me and walked away, leaving me standing there, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? The police? His family? I sat back down, trying to wrap my head around it. I picked at my sandwich, but I wasn't hungry anymore. Every time I glanced over at him, he was avoiding my eyes. Like he didn't care, like none of it mattered. The whole thing felt surreal, and I started to wonder if maybe I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't him. People change, right? I could have been mistaken. But deep down, I knew it was him. Paul. There was no doubt in my mind. I left the diner, my stomach in knots. I didn't call anyone. I figured maybe I'd give it some time, think it over, decide what to do. But something about the whole thing wouldn't let go of me. It just nodded me, that look on his face when I said his name. That quick flicker of recognition before he pretended he didn't know me. A couple of days later, I started hearing rumors. People were disappearing. It wasn't just one or two, it was a few over the span of a week. A guy who worked at the gas station down the road. A woman who lived alone a few miles outside of town. A teenager who'd been out with friends one night and never came home. At first, no one connected the dots. This kind of thing didn't happen in our town. People didn't just go missing like that. It was too small, too quiet. But it kept happening, and the police didn't have any answers. That's when I started thinking about Paul again. The more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. How had he ended up working at that diner under a different name? Why had he lied to me? And why were people disappearing now, right after I'd seen him again? I drove back to the diner one evening, just before closing. The place was nearly empty. I sat at the counter and waited for him to come out from the back. When he finally did, he didn't look surprised to see me. "I told you, you've got the wrong guy," he said before I even opened my mouth. I didn't back down this time. "I don't believe you. I know who you are. And I know something's going on." His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. "You should leave," he said, his voice low. "You don't belong here." There was something threatening in the way he said it, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I paid for my drink and left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched as I walked out to my car. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the disappearances, about Paul or Pete, or whoever he was, and the way he'd looked at me in the diner. I was sure he had something to do with it. There was no other explanation. The next morning, I decided to drive out to the old diner again. I needed to know more. Maybe I was wrong, maybe I was paranoid, but I couldn't let it go. When I pulled into the parking lot, though, the place was shut down. A closed for repairs sign hung in the window, and there was no sign of anyone inside. I drove around the back, hoping to find someone who could tell me what was going on, but the lot was empty. I don't know what happened after that. The disappearances stopped as suddenly as they had started, and the police never found any answers. The diner eventually reopened, but I didn't go back. I couldn't. Sometimes I think about that night at the diner, about Paul Pete, whatever his name was, and I wonder if I should have done something more. Called the police, told someone what I knew. Maybe it would have made a difference, maybe not. But I can't shake the feeling that there's something I missed, something bigger going on that I was never meant to understand. And I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, watching. I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. I needed a break from everything. Just me, the woods, and some peace and quiet for a few days. I found a spot deep in the forest, far away from anyone, with a small clearing that seemed perfect to set up camp. It wasn't on any official trail, just a place I came across while hiking off the beaten path. I'd always liked the idea of solitude, and this place felt like it would give me just that. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was that someone had already been there. The remnants of a campfire, some old cans, and a couple of folding chairs were scattered around, but no tent, no sign of anyone being there recently. It looked abandoned. The campsite didn't seem like it had been touched in at least a few weeks. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in a while. At first, I thought about moving on, but the place was ideal. The trees formed a natural barrier, and there was a small stream not too far off for fresh water. Plus, I liked the idea of being in a spot where no one would bother me. I unpacked my gear and set up my tent, making sure everything was in order before the sun started to set. I found the journal later, tucked under one of the folding chairs. It was a little beat up, the cover worn and the pages smudged with dirt. I don't know why I opened it. I guess curiosity got the better of me. Inside were scribbled notes, sketches, and entries that didn't make much sense at first. The first few pages were pretty normal. Whoever had been there had written about the weather, the hike, some small things like birds they saw or the kinds of trees around. But as I flipped through, the tone started to change. The handwriting became messier, the words frantic, almost as if the person had been rushing to write everything down. They started talking about hearing things at night, branches snapping, soft footsteps, breathing outside their tent. They thought it was just animals at first, but then they started to feel like they were being watched. There were pages where they'd drawn maps of the surrounding area, marking spots where they thought they'd seen movement. They mentioned finding small items moved around their camp, a spoon out of place, a flashlight that wasn't where they left it. At first, I laughed it off. Being out in the woods for too long can mess with your head, make you paranoid, especially if you're alone. I set the journal aside and finished setting up my camp. I made dinner, started a fire, and tried to relax. But that journal, it stuck with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. After a while, I picked it up again and read more. The person who wrote it kept going on about feeling like someone was out there, watching them. There were mentions of shadows, figures moving between the trees, but whenever they went to look, there was no one there. The last few entries were short, more like scribbles than full sentences. They wrote about hearing footsteps, louder now, closer to the tent. They described waking up in the middle of the night, hearing something or someone breathing outside the thin walls of their tent. The last page was smeared with dirt, and I couldn't make out all the words, but it ended with something like they're here before the writing just trailed off. It left me with this uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I tossed the journal aside again, telling myself it was just someone freaking out in the woods, probably imagining things. But even as I told myself that, I started noticing how quiet the woods had gotten. The sun was setting, and the wind barely rustled the leaves. I could hear my own breathing, and that was it. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about those entries. The way the person described hearing things outside their tent felt too real. I knew it was just in my head, but once it got dark, every little noise made me jump. The crackle of the fire dying down, the occasional rustling of leaves, it all seemed too loud. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. It was pitch black, and my fire had gone out. The only light came from the moon, shining faintly through the trees. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps outside my tent. I froze. I didn't want to move, didn't even want to breathe too loud. The footsteps were slow, circling the tent. I thought it had to be an animal, a deer, maybe, but the steps were too heavy. They were human. I was sure of it. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling in the dark, but I didn't turn it on. I just held it, waiting. The footsteps stopped. Whoever or whatever it was just standing there, right outside. I could hear it breathing. Not deep breaths, but shallow, almost as if they were trying not to be heard. I stayed still, my mind racing. Should I get out? Should I confront whoever it was? But the thought of unzipping the tent, stepping out into the dark, terrified me. What if they were waiting for me? I didn't know if they were armed, or if they were alone. The journal kept flashing through my mind. The person who wrote it was convinced someone had been watching them. What if they never left? Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The footsteps started again, moving away this time, fading into the distance. I didn't move until I was sure they were gone. My heart was still pounding, but I forced myself to unzip the tent just a little, enough to peek outside. The campsite was empty. There were no signs of anyone there, but the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. I couldn't see anything out of place, no footprints, nothing. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there, clutching my flashlight, staring at the tent flap until the sun started to rise. Once it was light enough, I packed up my things as quickly as I could. I didn't want to be there anymore. The journal, the footsteps, it was all too much. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me all night. As I was packing up, I found something that made my stomach drop. It was small, barely noticeable at first. A knife, lying just outside the entrance to my tent. It wasn't mine. I hadn't brought a knife like that with me, and I hadn't seen it when I set up camp the day before. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. Whoever had been outside my tent the night before had left it there. A warning? A threat? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. I grabbed my pack, left the knife where it was, and started hiking back to my car as fast as I could. The whole way back, I felt like I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but the trail was empty. Still, that feeling wouldn't leave me, the sense that someone was just out of sight, watching me, waiting for the right moment. When I finally got back to my car, I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me. I threw my pack in the back seat and locked the doors as soon as I was inside. I sat there for a minute, catching my breath, trying to convince myself that it was over. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd barely gotten out of there. I don't know what happened to the person who wrote that journal. Maybe they got spooked and left, or maybe something worse happened. I'll never know. But I do know one thing, I'm never going back to that campsite again. Whatever or whoever was out there that night didn't want me there. And I'm not sticking around to find out why. I never really thought much about the rumors at first. Small towns always have their stories, and you hear things you don't really believe, but they stick with you anyway. One of those stories was about this little boy, Evan, who went missing for a couple of days a few months ago. They found him wandering along the edge of the woods near his home, dazed and confused. He didn't remember anything about where he'd been or what had happened to him. The whole town was buzzing about it for a while. People had their theories, but the family didn't talk much about it. The boy seemed fine physically, and after a couple of weeks, everything sort of went back to normal, or at least, that's what I thought. I met Evan a few times at the local park, and he seemed like a typical kid. A little quieter than the others, but I figured that was just because of what happened. I didn't know his parents too well, but when they needed someone to babysit him for a weekend, I offered. I had the time, and they seemed like they needed a break. They were always a bit on edge since Evan had gone missing. I went over on a Friday night. His parents gave me the rundown, meals in the fridge, bedtime at 8, and a list of emergency numbers on the counter. Pretty standard stuff. Evan was sitting at the kitchen table, coloring when I arrived. He didn't say much, just looked up at me with these big, dark eyes before going back to his drawing. His parents seemed relieved to leave, and once they were gone, it was just the two of us. The first couple of hours were uneventful. Evan was quiet but polite. He played with his toys while I read on the couch. It was a little too quiet for my liking, but I didn't think much of it. Kids can be shy. I figured he just needed some time to warm up. It wasn't until after dinner that things started to feel off. I noticed Evan was acting strange. He kept glancing at the windows, like he was expecting someone to be outside. Every time I asked him if something was wrong, he'd just shake his head and go back to whatever he was doing. But the way he kept looking over his shoulder made me feel uneasy. Around 7, I went to check on him while he was playing in his room. I found him sitting by the window, staring out into the backyard. The sun had just started to set, and the shadows were long and dark. He didn't turn around when I came in. "Evan, what are you looking at?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though something about the way he was staring out there made my skin crawl. "Nothing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I walked over to him and looked outside. There was nothing there. Just the yard, the trees swaying in the evening breeze, and the fading light. But the way he was fixated on that empty space made me feel like I was missing something. Like there was something out there I couldn't see. After a few more minutes, I convinced him to come back to the living room. We played a board game, but his mind wasn't in it. He kept glancing back toward the window, and every time I looked at him, he'd quickly look away, like he didn't want me to notice. I tried not to let it get to me, but something about the house felt wrong. Too still. Too quiet. Even the air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. I chalked it up to nerves, maybe just getting caught up in the strange vibe the kid was giving off. But then, later that night, when I was putting him to bed, I found the notebook. I was helping Evan straighten up his room when I noticed it shoved under his pillow. A small, spiral-bound notebook, the kind kids use for doodling or practicing their writing. When I pulled it out, Evan stiffened, his face going pale. "Can I see what you've been drawing?" I asked, keeping my voice light, trying not to spook him. He didn't answer, just stared at the floor, his fingers twisting in his shirt. I opened the notebook, and the first few pages were just what you'd expect from a kid: stick figures, animals, scribbles. But as I flipped further, the drawings started to change. They became darker, more detailed. There were pictures of people, tall, shadowy figures, all standing in a line, looking straight ahead. Some were drawn outside the house, others in the yard, just standing there. I kept flipping, my heart starting to race. The drawings got more frantic. The figures were always there, watching. There were more of them now, surrounding the house, closer and closer with each page. One of the last drawings was of the living room, and through the window, you could see one of those shadowy figures standing outside, staring in. The detail in it was unsettling, way more than I'd expect from a kid Evan's age. It was almost too real. I looked at Evan, my throat tight. "Who are these people?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He wouldn't look at me. "They're outside," he whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. "They come when it gets dark." I didn't know what to say. My first instinct was to tell him it was just his imagination, that it was all in his head. But something about the way he said it, the fear in his voice, made my stomach turn. I glanced out the window again, but of course, there was nothing there. Just the night. I tried to shake it off, put him to bed, and told myself I was being ridiculous. I mean, he was a kid, right? Kids draw creepy things all the time. But after he fell asleep, I couldn't stop thinking about those drawings. About the way he kept staring out the windows, like he was expecting to see something or someone out there. I sat in the living room, trying to read, but every little sound made me jump. The wind outside, the creak of the house settling, it all felt too loud, too deliberate. And then I heard it. A soft rustling, like something moving outside the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought about going to the window, looking out to prove to myself that there was nothing there. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to see. Instead, I just sat there, listening, every nerve in my body on edge. The noise stopped after a few minutes, but I didn't relax. I couldn't. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the dark window, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, but that didn't make me feel any better. The next morning, I was exhausted. I barely slept, too on edge from the night before. Evan seemed fine, though. He was back to his quiet self, playing with his toys like nothing had happened. I asked him about the notebook again, but he didn't want to talk about it. He just shrugged and said he didn't remember drawing any of it. I left the house that afternoon, and as soon as I got outside, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The air felt lighter, the tension in my chest loosening. I handed Evan back to his parents and tried to brush off the whole weekend as just my imagination running wild. But even now, I can't stop thinking about those drawings. About the figures standing outside the house, watching. I've driven by their house a few times since then, just out of curiosity. Every time, I find myself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something or someone standing there, watching. I never see anything, but that doesn't make the feeling go away. Something happened to that boy when he went missing. I don't know what it was, but whatever it was, I'm sure it's still out there. And I don't think it's done watching. I booked the cabin as a last-minute getaway. It was one of those places you find on those rental sites, advertised as secluded and perfect for unwinding, which was exactly what I needed. Life had been rough the last few months. Work was hell, and I was going through some personal stuff, so when I saw the pictures of this cozy little place tucked away in the woods, it felt like a sign. The price was cheap, too, almost suspiciously cheap, but I figured it was just because it was off-season. When I got there, it looked just like the photos. A small cabin, nothing fancy, but it was clean and well kept. The trees around it were thick and tall, giving the whole area this peaceful, quiet vibe. There wasn't another house or cabin in sight. It was exactly what I wanted. The first night was fine. I settled in, made myself some dinner, and sat on the porch with a drink, listening to the wind through the trees. I didn't hear anything else. No animals, no cars in the distance, nothing. Just silence. It was strange at first, but I liked it. The kind of quiet you don't get in the city. The next day, I decided to take a walk around the area. There was a small path that led into the woods, so I followed it, figuring I'd explore a bit. About an hour into the hike, I came across a clearing. In the middle of it was a car, an older model SUV, covered in leaves and dirt, like it hadn't been moved in weeks. I walked up to it, thinking maybe it belonged to someone staying at a nearby cabin, but when I got closer, I realized there was something off about it. The windows were dusty, and the inside looked like it had been abandoned. There were a few things scattered in the back seat, some clothes, an empty fast food bag, but no sign of anyone. I knocked on the windows, called out to see if anyone was around, but the place was dead quiet. I didn't want to pry, so I just left it. Maybe someone had left their car there and was hiking around. I wasn't sure, but it didn't seem like my problem. That night, back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the weird feeling I got from seeing that car. I tried to forget about it, but it kept creeping back into my mind. Why would someone leave their car like that in the middle of nowhere? It was strange, but not exactly alarming, at least, not yet. I spent most of the evening inside, reading and trying to relax. But the silence that had felt so peaceful the first night was starting to get under my skin. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was too quiet. Like the kind of quiet that feels wrong, like the world had stopped moving outside. Before bed, I did something I don't usually do. I looked up the place online, curious to see if anyone had mentioned anything strange about it in reviews. Most of them were pretty standard. People talking about how great it was, how peaceful, how they loved the hiking trails. But then I found one review, buried among the others, that mentioned something that stuck with me. It was from a couple who had stayed at the cabin a few months back. They said they had an amazing time, but toward the end of their stay, they saw a car parked on one of the trails that led deeper into the woods. They didn't think much of it at first, but when they got home, they realized the car had been there for days, maybe even weeks, without moving. They tried to reach out to the owner, but never got a response. The weirdest part? The couple never returned home after that trip. The rental site had marked their reservation as no-show for the next booking, and the cabin had sat empty until I came along. Reading that made my skin crawl. The car they described, it had to be the one I saw. I told myself it was just a coincidence. People disappear for all sorts of reasons. Maybe they got lost, or maybe something else happened. But the fact that the car was still there, that the couple had never come back, made me uneasy. The next day, I went back to the clearing. The car was still there, exactly where I'd seen it. This time, though, I decided to take a closer look. I opened the door, and the smell hit me immediately. It wasn't overpowering, but there was something stale about it, like old food left in a closed space for too long. Inside, there were more signs that whoever had been there left in a hurry. An open suitcase in the back, with clothes spilling out. A couple of water bottles in the cup holders, half empty. But no sign of the people who had packed those bags, or drank from those bottles. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. It didn't make any sense. Why would someone leave all this behind? Why hadn't anyone come to check on the car? I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't sure what I'd even tell them. Hey, I found this abandoned car in the middle of the woods, and I think it might belong to people who disappeared. It sounded insane. That night, things got worse. I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside the cabin, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the kind of sounds you expect in the woods but somehow felt wrong. Like they were too close, too deliberate. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone or something walking around out there, just out of sight. At one point, I got up to check the windows, and that's when I saw it. Out in the distance, near the tree line, there was a light. Just a small, flickering light, like a lantern or a flashlight. It was moving slowly, bobbing up and down as if someone was walking with it. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. Who would be out there in the middle of the night? The nearest cabin was miles away, and the trail wasn't exactly popular. The light moved closer, just for a moment, before it stopped. And then it went out, leaving nothing but darkness. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the window, waiting to see if the light would come back. It didn't, but the feeling that someone was out there didn't go away. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay there another night. Something wasn't right. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and got ready to leave. But as I was loading my car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt, just outside the cabin, were footprints. Fresh ones, leading from the woods right up to the door. They weren't mine. They were too large, and they were spaced in a way that suggested someone had been walking slowly, deliberately. I got out of there as fast as I could, but the whole drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see someone or something following me. I never reported the car. I didn't even tell anyone about what I'd seen or what I thought might have happened. It felt too crazy, too unbelievable. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. Something happened to those people, and I was lucky enough to get out before it happened to me too. It started as a regular day. My daughter, Lily, and I went to the park just like we always did when the weather was nice. She loves to run around, feed the ducks, and climb the jungle gym. It was one of those big parks with a lake in the middle, benches lining the walking trails, and trees everywhere. It's the kind of place where you see the same faces, moms with strollers, joggers, old men fishing. Nothing unusual. We've been going there since she was a baby, so I never thought anything could go wrong. I let Lily run ahead like she always did. She was wearing her bright yellow jacket, the one I got her for her birthday. I liked that it was so easy to spot. She'd run, then stop and wait for me, never too far ahead. Always within my line of sight. But that day, I turned to answer a text. I swear it was just a second. When I looked up, Lily wasn't there. At first, I wasn't too worried. Maybe she had just ducked behind a tree or was sitting on a bench. Kids do that, they get distracted by something small, and you find them picking flowers or staring at a bug. I walked a little faster, calling her name. Lily. I expected her to pop out, giggling like she always did when she tried to scare me. But she didn't answer. I picked up the pace, heading toward the playground. I could see all the kids running around, climbing the jungle gym, but Lily wasn't one of them. I scanned the area, nothing. My heart started to pound. I called her name louder this time, but no response. I told myself not to panic. There were people around, other parents. Someone would have seen her if she wandered off. I asked a mom nearby if she'd seen a little girl in a yellow jacket. She shook her head, looking a bit concerned. I tried the man walking his dog, a group of teenagers sitting by the fountain. No one had seen her. Minutes started to blur together. My voice got hoarse from yelling her name. People began to notice, offering to help look, but no one had seen where she went. I kept walking, checking every corner of the park, every trail, but with each step, I felt the panic rising. It didn't make sense. She was right there. She had been right in front of me. That's when I saw him. He was sitting on a bench near the trees, a man in his 40s maybe, dressed in a jacket and jeans, kind of scruffy looking. He was watching me, like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. I don't know why, but something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. But I was desperate, so I walked over to him. "Did you see a little girl? Yellow jacket, brown hair, about 5? I asked, my voice shaky. He nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting the question. "Yeah, I saw her." My heart jumped. "Where? Did she run off? Where did she go?" He stood up, his hands shoved in his pockets. "She got into a van," he said, his voice low. The world seemed to stop for a second. My brain couldn't process what he just said. "A van?" I repeated, trying to make sense of it. He nodded again. "Yeah. I saw a van pull up on the other side of the park. She got in with some guy." I felt my legs go weak. My stomach churned. "What do you mean she got in? Why didn't you stop her? What kind of van? What did the guy look like?" He didn't seem fazed by my panic. He just shrugged. "I don't know, man. Just a van. White, maybe. I think it went toward the north exit." I wanted to scream, to grab him and shake him. Why hadn't he done something? Why hadn't anyone seen this happen? But instead, I grabbed onto the one piece of information I had at the north exit. I started running. I didn't wait for him, but he followed me, jogging to keep up. "You're going to need help," he said. "I can help you look." I didn't care who helped me. All I could think about was finding that van, finding Lily. I ran through the park, weaving through the trees and past the lake, barely able to see straight through the tears filling my eyes. We reached the north exit, but there was no van. No sign of anything unusual. I spun around, looking in every direction, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The man stood beside me, watching me with those same calm eyes. "You sure it was the north exit?" I asked him, my voice trembling. "Maybe it was another one?" He nodded slowly again. "Yeah, it was this one. But they might have left already." I felt like I was going to collapse. The ground felt like it was slipping out from under me. But something about his answer didn't sit right. Why hadn't he done more? Why was he so calm about all this? I looked at him closely for the first time. His clothes were dirty, like he'd been out here for a while. His hands were scratched, his nails filthy. He wasn't acting like someone who had just witnessed a child being taken. "Why didn't you do anything?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He shrugged again. "I didn't think it was my place. Thought maybe she knew the guy." My blood ran cold. That didn't make any sense. If he saw a child getting into a van with a stranger, why wouldn't he have tried to stop it? Why didn't he tell someone sooner? I took a step back from him. "Did you see the guy's face?" I asked, my voice firmer now. He shook his head. "No." He was wearing a hat. Could have been anyone. I didn't believe him. Something was off. I could feel it in my gut. I backed away from him, glancing around the park, but there was no one else nearby. Just the two of us, standing by the exit, with no sign of Lily or the van. "I need to call the police," I said, pulling out my phone. He didn't react. He just stood there, watching me with those same cold eyes. "Yeah, maybe you should," he said. But there was something in his voice, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I dialed 911, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I gave the dispatcher all the information I had, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I kept glancing at the man, half expecting him to do something, but he just stood there, watching me. When I hung up, he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, though. It was something else, something that made my skin crawl. "They'll find her," he said. "Or they won't." Hard to say with these things. I stepped back again, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. "Kids disappear all the time. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't." My blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer. He just smiled that same unsettling smile and walked away, disappearing into the trees like he'd never been there at all. I waited for the police. They combed the park, checked the exits, but there was no van. No sign of Lily. The man was gone, too, like he'd never existed. I tried to tell them about him, but they didn't seem to take it seriously. They said he was probably just a drifter, someone who saw something and misunderstood. But I knew better. I never found out what happened to Lily. They never found the van, and the man never showed up again. It's been months now, and every day I wonder if she's still out there, or if that man had something to do with it. All I know is that I'll never forget the way he smiled at me, like he knew something I didn't, like he knew I'd never see her again. It started out like any normal day. My roommate, Jacob, and I had been living together for almost 6 months. We weren't close, but we got along fine, shared some meals, talked now and then. He was quiet, liked to keep to himself, but we'd chat about classes or whatever we were watching on TV. Nothing weird. Nothing that'd make me think something was wrong. That night, Jacob went to bed early. I remember because he'd left his light on in his room. I figured I'd remind him in the morning to turn it off next time, save some electricity. I stayed up late, playing video games like I usually did when I didn't have classes early the next day. Everything was normal. I didn't hear anything unusual coming from his room, no signs of him leaving or anything like that. When I finally went to bed around 2 a.m., his door was still closed, his light still shining through the crack under the door. I didn't think much of it. I just went to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it right away, but you know that feeling, like something's just wrong? I brushed it off, figuring I was still groggy, and got ready for class. Jacob's door was still closed when I walked by, but I didn't hear him moving around. I thought maybe he had an early class or something, so I just went about my morning. It wasn't until I got back to the dorm later that afternoon that I started to get worried. His door was still closed, but now there was no light coming from under it. I knocked, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. That's when I opened the door. His room looked exactly the same as it always did. His bed was unmade, his clothes were scattered on the floor, and his laptop was still sitting on the desk, the screen black. But Jacob wasn't there. It was like he'd just vanished. I tried calling him, but his phone was sitting right there on his nightstand, buzzing as my call went through. All his stuff was there, his backpack, his wallet, everything. But he was gone. I figured maybe he'd gone out for a walk or something, left his phone behind. It was weird, but I didn't panic right away. Maybe I was overthinking it. But as the hours ticked by and there was still no sign of him, I started to get worried. By evening, I had enough. I went to the RA's room and knocked, telling him that my roommate was missing, that he'd left everything behind, and I hadn't seen him all day. The RA, Derek, looked at me like I was crazy. "Roommate," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Dude, you don't have a roommate." I laughed, thinking he was messing with me. "Jacob," I said. "You know, the guy who lives with me? He's been here since the start of the semester." Derek just stared at me. "You've been living in that room alone since you moved in, man. There's no Jacob." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told him that Jacob had been living with me since August, that we shared the room, and that something was seriously wrong. Derek didn't budge. He just kept telling me that I was the only one assigned to that room. I left his room, frustrated and confused. Maybe Derek was screwing with me, trying to pull some kind of prank, but it didn't make sense. I went back to our dorm and stood in the middle of Jacob's room. His stuff was still there. His bed, his clothes, his laptop. I wasn't imagining it. He was real. I decided to call campus security. This had to be serious if no one else seemed to remember him. They came by, 2 officers, and I explained everything. I told them Jacob had gone missing, that he hadn't taken any of his belongings, and that no one was taking me seriously. They looked through the room. They saw his stuff, everything, but when they asked for his student ID number, I realized I didn't know it. I didn't think I needed to. We never shared that kind of information. I told them his full name, Jacob Harrison, but when they ran it through the system, nothing came up. No student by that name. Not in any records. Not enrolled in any classes. I insisted he was real, that I wasn't imagining this, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. They told me to calm down, that maybe I was stressed, maybe I was confusing things. They left without doing anything, and I just sat there in the middle of his room, staring at his empty bed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up in my bed, thinking, trying to make sense of it all. I kept telling myself that this couldn't be happening, that people don't just disappear like that. I even called his parents, hoping they'd have some answers, but the number I had for them didn't work. It was like everything connected to Jacob just vanished. I went to some of our mutual friends the next day. Or at least, I thought they were mutual friends. I asked them about Jacob, and they all gave me the same blank look. "Who?" they'd ask. "Dude, I've never heard of him." I started questioning myself, wondering if maybe I was losing it. But every time I went back to our dorm, his things were still there. His stupid posters on the wall, his dirty laundry in the corner. All of it. I didn't know what else to do, so I started searching through his stuff, trying to find something that would prove he was real, something I could take to someone to make them believe me. I went through his drawers, his desk, even his laptop. But it was like nothing was really his. There were no photos of him, no personal documents, nothing that could tie into the school or anyone else. It was like he'd never existed. The days passed, and I felt like I was losing my mind. I barely went to class. I couldn't focus. Every time I walked past his room, I'd peek inside, hoping for some sign of him, some clue as to where he went. But it was always the same, his empty room, his stuff gathering dust. One night, about a week after Jacob disappeared, I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't know why, but something made me get out of bed and walk over to his room. The door was slightly ajar, just like he'd left it the night he vanished. But this time, when I looked inside, something was different. His bed was made. It wasn't just made, it looked like no one had ever slept in it. The posters on the wall were gone, the clothes scattered on the floor were gone, everything was gone. The room was spotless, like it had been cleaned out by someone. Like no one had ever lived there. I stood in the doorway, staring at the empty room, my heart racing. I knew I wasn't imagining things. I knew Jacob had been real. But now, it was like he'd never been there at all. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I backed away and shut the door. I haven't opened it since. I can't. Every time I walk by, I feel this overwhelming sense of dread, like if I open it again, I'll see something I don't want to see. It's been months now, and no one remembers Jacob. His room is empty, like it's waiting for the next person to move in. I've stopped trying to convince people he was real because no one believes me. They look at me like I'm crazy, like I've imagined the whole thing. But I know he was real. I know he was here. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear footsteps coming from his room, even though it's empty. I don't know what happened to Jacob. I don't know where he went or why no one else remembers him. But I can't forget. I can't forget the way his stuff just disappeared, the way everyone acted like he never existed. And I'm scared. I'm scared because if he can disappear like that, maybe I can too. I was on my way back from a work trip, just driving down this long stretch of highway, trying to stay awake. It was one of those roads where you could go for miles without seeing anything but trees and more trees. No towns, no gas stations, just emptiness. I'd been driving for hours and figured it'd be smart to pull over at the next rest stop to stretch my legs, maybe grab a snack from the vending machine. It was late, around 10:30 p.m., maybe closer to 11, but I wasn't in a rush. The rest stop appeared out of nowhere, just this little patch of pavement with a few empty cars and some dim lights. I pulled in, parking close to the building so I could use the bathroom. When I got out of the car, I noticed the place felt deserted. There were 2 other cars parked there, but no one in sight. The vending machines hummed quietly, and the street lights flickered like they hadn't been replaced in a while. I wasn't too concerned though, just focused on getting in and out. As I walked toward the building, I heard someone running behind me. My heart jumped, and I spun around. It was this young girl, maybe 14 or 15, sprinting toward me from the far side of the parking lot. She looked scared, no, terrified, her eyes wide, hair all messy like she'd been through something bad. "Help me. Please, you have to help me," she cried, her voice shaky. She grabbed my arm, clutching it tight like I was the only person who could save her. I froze for a second, trying to make sense of what was happening. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" I asked, looking around, expecting someone else to show up, maybe a parent or another driver. "They're after me," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "I've been held for years. I escaped. Please, don't let them take me back." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing. Held captive? For years? This didn't seem real. It sounded like something straight out of a movie, but the way she looked filthy, her clothes torn, and her face pale, she didn't seem like she was making it up. I glanced toward the parking lot, but there was no one around. Just the empty rest stop and the 2 parked cars that looked like they'd been there for hours. The girl tugged at my sleeve again, her grip tightening. "They'll come looking for me. You have to hide me. Please." I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to rush her to my car, lock the doors, and drive away, but I was still trying to process what was happening. Before I could even respond, a man appeared from behind one of the parked cars. He was walking fast toward us, his face calm, too calm. He didn't look panicked or angry, just focused. "Excuse me, miss," he called out as he got closer. "That's my daughter." The girl's grip tightened on my arm, her nails digging into my skin. He's lying, she hissed through clenched teeth, her voice barely a whisper now. Please, don't let him take me. The man was maybe in his late 40s, dressed in a flannel shirt and jeans, like he'd just come off a camping trip or something. His face was clean-shaven, and he smiled as he approached, but there was something off about him. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I'm sorry if she's been bothering you, he said when he reached us, glancing down at the girl. She's not well. She's been having some problems, you know, mental health issues. We've been trying to get her help. The girl shook her head violently, stepping closer to me like I was her shield. He's not my dad, she muttered, her voice trembling. He's not. Please, don't believe him. I felt like I was caught between two sides of a story, and I had no idea who to trust. The man's face was calm, too calm, like he'd rehearsed this whole thing a million times before. But the girl, her fear, it felt real. Too real to ignore. I cleared my throat, trying to sound as confident as I could. Is there any way we can call someone? The police, maybe? Just to figure this out? The man's smile faded, just for a second, but it was long enough for me to catch it. That won't be necessary, he said, his voice steady. She's just upset. We'll be on our way now. He reached for the girl's arm, but she jerked away, her eyes filling with tears. Don't let him take me, she begged, her voice cracking. I'll die if you let him take me. I backed up a step, putting myself between them, my heart racing now. I think we should call the police, I said, my voice shaking despite trying to stay calm. Just to be sure. The man's expression changed then, like a mask slipping. His eyes narrowed, and the calm demeanor vanished. You don't need to get involved in this, he said, his voice harder now, almost threatening. It's a family matter. I looked at the girl again, her face pleading with me to believe her. My gut twisted, and I could feel the tension building, like something bad was about to happen. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking, trying to dial 911. Before I could hit the call button, the man took a step closer, his face inches from mine. Put the phone down, he said, his voice low and dangerous. This isn't what you think it is. I stood my ground, my thumb hovering over the screen. I'm calling the police, I said, louder this time, hoping someone would hear me, hoping someone would show up. If she's your daughter, they'll clear it up. The man's eyes flicked to the girl, then back to me. For a second, I thought he might try to grab the phone, but then he just smiled again. This cold, empty smile that sent chills down my spine. Do what you need to do, he said, stepping back. But I'll be here when they arrive. That threw me off. I didn't expect him to just back down. My thumb hovered over the phone screen, but before I could call, I heard the sound of tires crunching gravel. Another car pulling into the rest stop. A black van. The girl's face went pale when she saw it, her breath coming in short gasps. Please, she whispered, backing away. Please, don't let them take me. The van rolled to a stop, and the man stepped toward it, his whole demeanor shifting back to that calm, collected state. The side door of the van slid open, and two more men got out, both dressed casually but with the same unnerving calmness as the first guy. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea what was going on, but everything in me screamed that this wasn't right. These men, they weren't just trying to help a girl with mental health issues. I hit the call button on my phone and held it to my ear. The man glanced at me, but he didn't stop me. He just smiled that cold, dead smile as the two other men walked toward us. 911, what's your emergency? Came the operator's voice on the other end. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. The girl clutched my arm again, trembling, her eyes locked on the van. "This is your last chance," the man said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't want to be involved in this." But I was involved now. I had no choice. "I'm at a rest stop," I finally managed to say, my voice shaky. There's a girl here. She says she's been kidnapped. There's a van." Before I could finish, the man turned and walked toward the van. The two other men followed him, and without another word, they got back inside. The door slid shut, and the van pulled away, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, my heart pounding, the phone still pressed to my ear. The girl let out a shaky breath, her grip loosening on my arm. "They're gone," I whispered, barely able to believe it myself. But the girl didn't relax. She just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "They'll come back," she said softly. "They always come back." I stayed with her until the police arrived. I'd been working late and missed the last train, so I decided to take the late-night bus home. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only option left. The bus was almost empty, and I took a seat toward the back, trying to ignore the exhaustion settling in. The few other passengers were scattered around, and I thought it would be a quiet ride. About halfway through the trip, I noticed a man sitting a few rows ahead of me, looking around nervously. He was in his 30s, scruffy, with a torn jacket that seemed out of place for the weather. He kept glancing over his shoulder and shifting in his seat, his eyes darting around like he was expecting something or someone. I tried to mind my own business, but his behavior was unsettling. Every time he looked my way, his eyes widened slightly, and I could see him startle at the slightest noise. It made me uneasy, but I figured he was just another person having a rough night. As the bus approached the final stop, the man's anxiety seemed to escalate. He got up and shuffled toward the back, his eyes still darting around, and leaned closer to me. His breath smelled like old coffee, and he whispered urgently, "I need you to listen to me. I've been missing for weeks." I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" Just don't let them see us talking," he said, looking over his shoulder again. "They're watching me. I don't know who they are, but I can't go back. They'll take me again." His voice was shaky, and I could see real fear in his eyes. I glanced around the bus, trying to see if anyone else was paying attention, but the other passengers were either asleep or focused on their phones. "Are you sure? Maybe you should tell someone," I started, but he cut me off. No. If I tell anyone, they'll find me. I need to get out of here, but I don't know where to go." I wasn't sure what to make of it. He looked like he was in a bad situation, but it was hard to know how serious it was. The bus slowed down and stopped, the doors opening to let passengers out. The man hesitated, looking around with visible distress. "Come on," I said, trying to sound as calm as possible. "Let's get off the bus and talk somewhere else." We got off, and he followed me to a nearby bench. The streetlights were dim, casting long shadows, and there were a few cars parked along the street. He sat down, his hands trembling as he wrung them together. "Please," he said, almost pleading. "You have to believe me. They're everywhere. They were following me before I even got on this bus." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Okay, I believe you. Just tell me what happened." He took a deep breath, his eyes darting around. "I was at home one night, and then I woke up in some place I didn't recognize. I don't remember how I got there, but it was like a basement or a warehouse. There were other people there, too, but I couldn't talk to them. I don't know if they were real or just part of it. His voice trembled more as he spoke. They kept saying they were watching us, that we were part of some experiment. I managed to escape, but now I don't know who to trust. They're looking for me. I could see he was genuinely frightened, and it was clear that something had happened to him. I tried to think of what to do next. Okay, let's call the police. If you're in danger, they might be able to help. No, he said, almost shouting. If you call them, they'll know where I am. You have to help me get away from here. His desperation was palpable, and I felt conflicted. I wanted to help, but I didn't know if it was safe or even possible. Okay, I said carefully, let's just stay here for a bit. I'll see if I can find a way to get you some help without alerting anyone who might be looking for you. I looked around, trying to come up with a plan. The street was quiet, and I could see a convenience store down the road. Maybe if I could get into a place where there were more people, he might feel safer. As I was thinking, I noticed a black SUV pulling up slowly along the street, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The SUV stopped a little way down from us, and I could make out the figures inside. My stomach dropped. It was like a scene from a movie, the kind where you know something bad is about to happen. The man noticed too. His face went pale, and he stood up quickly, his earlier calm completely gone. They're here, he whispered, grabbing my arm. They're here for me. I looked at the SUV, then at the man. We need to go, I said. Now. We ran down the street, staying close to the buildings. I could hear the SUV starting up and driving slowly behind us. The man was panicking, and I tried to keep him calm, guiding him toward the convenience store. We burst through the door, and the store clerk looked up, startled. Call the police, I said urgently. There's a man who needs help. He's being followed. The clerk picked up the phone, and I watched as the man slumped against the counter, his fear giving way to exhaustion. The store was small and brightly lit, and for the first time since I'd met him, he seemed a little bit safer. The police arrived not long after, and I explained the situation to them. The man gave his statement, and they took him in for questioning. The SUV had left by then, and I didn't see it again. I never found out exactly what had happened to him, but I hope he got the help he needed. It was one of the scariest things I've ever been through, but I'm glad I was able to help him get to safety. It had been a year since my husband, Tom, disappeared. We had searched everywhere, and the police had given up hope. I spent countless nights worrying, praying for his safe return, and eventually started trying to move on, though the weight of his absence never truly lifted. Then, one evening, as I was finishing up dinner, I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, there he was. Tom. He looked tired and disheveled, but it was undeniably him. He had a blank look in his eyes, and his clothes were worn out. I could barely believe it. I hugged him tightly, tears streaming down my face. He said he didn't remember where he'd been, but he was just grateful to be home. I tried to focus on the relief of having him back, but something in his tone and demeanor felt off. Over the next few days, Tom seemed distant. He went through the motions of returning to normal life, but didn't offer any details about what had happened to him. I kept my distance, not wanting to push him too hard, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. One afternoon, while he was out running errands, I decided to clean up his old belongings. I wanted to organize everything and make our home feel more normal again. As I sorted through his things, I came across a box of old photos and papers in the back of the closet. Among the papers, I found something unsettling. There were several notebooks filled with scribbles and drawings. They seemed to be Tom's, but they didn't make any sense. The pages were filled with disjointed notes and sketches. One drawing stood out, a crude map of what looked like an old warehouse, marked with a red X. Another page had a list of names, some crossed out and others highlighted. It was disturbing, but the real shock came when I found a small envelope hidden inside one of the notebooks. Inside the envelope were 2 photographs. One showed Tom, looking scared and disheveled, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. The other photograph was of a room that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years, with rusty metal shelves and broken furniture. The same man from the first photograph was in the room, but he was turned away from the camera. When Tom came home that evening, I decided it was time to confront him. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice. "Tom, I found some things in your old stuff. Can you explain these to me?" I showed him the photographs and the notebook entries. His face went pale as he looked at them. "Where did you find these?" he asked, his voice shaking. "In the box with your old things." "Tom, what is this? What happened to you?" He took a deep breath, then sat down heavily. I don't remember much. Just bits and pieces. I was taken. I was held somewhere, but I don't know where. They made me write things down. I had to." His eyes were filled with fear, and I could see the weight of his memories pressing down on him. "Who are they? Why did they let you go?" "I don't know," he said. "I was drugged for most of it. I woke up in a field and just started walking. I was found by a truck driver who took me to the nearest town. I wanted to believe him, but the photographs and notes told a different story. Why did you have a map and pictures of a warehouse? Why are there names on this list?" Tom looked at me, his eyes full of regret. "I don't know. I think they were trying to get me to remember something, or maybe they were trying to use me for something. I swear, I don't remember." I could see he was struggling to piece together his past, but his story didn't fully add up. I needed to find out more. I called the police and gave them the photographs and notes. They took the evidence seriously and promised to look into it. In the meantime, Tom tried to reintegrate into our lives, but the shadows of his past lingered. I saw him become increasingly anxious whenever he heard sirens or saw unfamiliar faces. The police investigation eventually led to a breakthrough. They discovered that the warehouse from the photograph was abandoned, but it had been used for illegal activities years ago. The man in the photograph was identified as someone with a history of involvement in criminal operations. Tom's case was tied to a larger network of missing persons, and it appeared he had been part of a forced operation that involved others being held and exploited. Tom didn't remember all the details, but with the investigation, some pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The more they uncovered, the more it seemed that he had been caught in something much larger than either of us had anticipated. It was a long and painful process, but in the end, Tom was able to find some peace. He began therapy to help deal with the trauma and the gaps in his memory. Although the experience was harrowing, I was relieved that we were able to get some answers and that he was safe. It was a strange and unsettling chapter in our lives, but we managed to rebuild, one step at a time. I was traveling through Europe on a solo trip, taking my time to explore little villages off the beaten path. It was late in the day when I pulled into this one village. It didn't seem like much, just a few rows of houses, a small square, and some shops. There was a quietness about the place, but not in a peaceful way. Something felt off as soon as I arrived, though I couldn't put my finger on what. I needed a place to stay for the night, so I went to the only inn I could find. The owner, an older man with graying hair, gave me a room without much fuss. He barely spoke, just handed me the key and pointed toward the stairs. His face was expressionless, like he wasn't happy to have me there, but I didn't think much of it. People in small villages can be like that, closed off to outsiders. The room was simple, clean enough, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I sat on the bed for a while, listening. There was no noise from the other rooms, no sounds of life outside. It was strange, considering it was only early evening. I decided to take a walk, see if I could find somewhere to eat, and maybe get a feel for the place. As I walked through the village, I noticed something. The streets were practically empty. I saw a few people here and there, but they moved quickly, their heads down, not meeting my eyes. It was like they were avoiding me. I tried to ask someone where I could get dinner, but the man just mumbled something and hurried off before I could catch what he said. I found a small cafe eventually. The woman behind the counter didn't greet me when I walked in, just watched me from the corner of her eye. I ordered a sandwich and sat by the window, looking out at the empty street. The feeling of something being wrong was stronger now, but I couldn't explain why. There was a heaviness in the air, like the whole village was holding its breath. While I was eating, an older woman came into the cafe and sat at the table next to mine. She glanced at me a few times, her eyes darting back and forth, like she was trying to decide something. After a few minutes, she leaned over and whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I froze, unsure if I had heard her right. "Excuse me?" I asked. She looked around nervously, then back at me. "It's not safe here. People disappear. You need to leave." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and I could see the fear in her eyes. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Before I could ask anything else, she stood up quickly and left the cafe without looking back. I watched her disappear down the street, my mind racing. Disappearances? What was she talking about? I finished my sandwich, paid, and left the cafe, heading back to the inn. As I walked, I noticed a few people watching me from their windows, but they pulled back the curtains when I looked their way. It was like the whole village was hiding something, and I was the only one who didn't know what it was. Back at the inn, the owner was sitting behind the counter. I hesitated for a moment, then walked up to him. "Is there something I should know about this village?" I asked. He didn't look up from the book he was pretending to read. "No," he said flatly. I pressed on. "I heard people have gone missing. Is that true?" His eyes flicked up to mine for just a second, and I saw something in them. Fear? Guilt? I couldn't tell. He didn't say anything, just went back to his book. It was clear I wasn't going to get any answers from him. I went up to my room, locking the door behind me. I didn't know what to make of everything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was happening in that village. The woman's warning kept playing in my head. People disappear. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every sound outside made me jump. Around midnight, I heard something. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside my window. My heart started racing. I got up and peeked through the curtains, but there was no one there. The village was dark and still, but I knew I had heard something. I lay back down, forcing myself to close my eyes, but the unease wouldn't let me rest. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted off. The next morning, I decided to leave the village. I didn't want to stick around to find out what was really going on. As I packed my bag, I heard voices outside the inn. I looked out the window and saw a small group of villagers standing in a tight circle, talking in hushed tones. Every now and then, one of them would glance up at the inn, and I had the distinct feeling they were talking about me. I hurried downstairs and checked out, thanking the innkeeper, who still wouldn't look me in the eye. As I walked through the village toward my car, I could feel people watching me. It was like the whole village knew something I didn't, and they were all waiting for me to figure it out. Just as I reached my car, someone grabbed my arm. I spun around to see the old woman from the cafe. "You didn't listen," she hissed, her grip tight. "They know you've been asking questions. You need to go. Now." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I nodded, pulling free from her grasp and getting into my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The villagers were still standing there, watching me leave. I thought I was safe once I was out of the village, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but the road behind me was empty. I drove for hours, trying to put as much distance between myself and that village as possible. Eventually, I stopped at a gas station in a larger town. I needed to fill up the tank and clear my head. As I paid for my gas, I asked the clerk if he had ever heard of the village I had just left. He looked at me strangely. "Yeah, I've heard of it," he said, glancing around like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "You're lucky to get out of there. People don't talk about it much, but folks have been disappearing around that place for years. No one knows why, but everyone knows to stay away." My blood ran cold. The woman in the cafe had been right. I should have left the moment I arrived. I didn't ask any more questions. I just wanted to get as far away from that village as I could. That night, I checked into a hotel in a different town. It was a bigger place, with more people around. It felt safer. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I kept thinking about the villagers, their silence, the way they avoided me. And I couldn't stop thinking about the people who had gone missing. Were they still out there somewhere? Or was the village hiding something far worse? I never found out. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I had escaped, and that was enough for me. For the rest of my trip, I stayed in larger towns, never going near any small villages again. I was driving late at night, coming back from a long weekend trip. The highway was mostly empty, and the few cars that passed me were just headlights disappearing into the distance. I had a couple of hours left before I got home, and I was tired, but I wanted to push through. I didn't want to stop anywhere for the night. It was sometime after midnight when I saw a figure on the side of the road, thumb out. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. The road was so dark, the only light coming from my headlights. But as I got closer, I could see him more clearly. A man, maybe in his mid-30s, wearing a jacket that looked too thin for how cold it was outside. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. It's not something I ever thought I'd do, especially not at night. But something about the way he looked made me slow down. He seemed desperate, like he really needed help. I pulled over a little ahead of him, my hands gripping the steering wheel, second-guessing my decision for a second before I rolled down the window. He jogged up to the car, and I noticed he was breathing hard, like he had been running. His face was pale, and there was dirt smeared across his cheek. "Please," he said, his voice shaking. "I need to get away from here. Can you help me?" I hesitated. Something about him seemed off, but I couldn't just leave him there. It was freezing, and he looked like he had been through something terrible. I unlocked the door. "Get in." He climbed into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind him. His hands were shaking, and he kept glancing out the window, like he expected someone to come out of the darkness at any second. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Anywhere," he said quickly. "Just away from here." I escaped. Escaped? I glanced at him, trying to figure out what he meant. His clothes were dirty, his hair matted, and there was a frantic look in his eyes that made me nervous. I was being held. By these people. I don't know who they are, but they took me. I managed to get away, but they're not far behind. They'll be looking for me. My stomach twisted at his words. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe him, but another part was screaming that something wasn't right. Still, I kept driving, trying to act like everything was normal. "How long were you with them?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Days. Maybe a week, I don't know. They kept me locked up in some kind of cabin. It was in the woods, far from any roads. I don't even know how I got out. I just ran when I had the chance." I nodded, but something about his story didn't add up. If he had escaped from these people, wouldn't they be farther away by now? Why would they still be so close? And why hadn't he tried to get help sooner? I glanced over at him again. He was staring out the window, his hands gripping the edge of the seat. His breathing was shallow, like he was still panicking. But there was something else in his eyes now. Something I couldn't place. "Did you see their faces?" I asked. "The people who took you?" He shook his head. "No. They wore masks. Always. I never saw who they were. They didn't talk much either, just told me what to do. When to eat, when to sleep. They didn't even explain why they had me. I think they're part of something bigger." I felt a chill run down my spine. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I pressed the gas pedal a little harder, wanting to put more distance between us and wherever he had come from. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "They knew about you." I froze. "What?" They talked about people on the road. Said they were watching. Waiting for someone like you to come along. I glanced at him, my heart racing. "What are you talking about?" His eyes were wide now, like he had realized something all at once. "They were waiting for a woman. Someone traveling alone. That's why they let me go." I couldn't breathe. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What are you saying?" "They let me go so I could find you." I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the highway. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell are you talking about?" His expression changed then, from fear to something else. Something darker. His breathing slowed, and he leaned back in the seat, a small smile playing on his lips. "They knew you'd stop for me. They know how to pick the right kind of person." I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle, but before I could pull it open, he grabbed my wrist. "Don't," he said, his voice calm now. "It's already too late. They're coming." I pulled my hand free and scrambled out of the car, my legs shaking as I stood on the empty road. I looked around, but there was no one. Just the dark highway stretching out in both directions, no lights, no signs of life. The man got out of the car slowly, stretching like he had all the time in the world. "You should have just kept driving," he said, his voice low. "Now you're part of it." I didn't wait to hear what else he had to say. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, just away from him, away from whatever was coming. But I could hear him behind me, his footsteps slow and steady, like he knew I wouldn't get far. "You can't outrun them," he called after me. "They always get what they want." I kept running, my legs burning, my heart ready to explode in my chest. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to see how close he was. But then I heard something else. A sound that made my blood turn to ice. A car engine. I looked over my shoulder and saw headlights in the distance, moving fast. Too fast. I veered off the road, stumbling down the embankment and into the trees. The branches scratched at my face, but I didn't care. I just needed to hide. I crouched behind a tree, trying to catch my breath, my heart slamming against my ribs. The car stopped on the road above me, and I heard doors opening. Footsteps. More than one person. They always get what they want, the man's voice echoed in my head. I pressed myself against a tree, holding my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. But I could hear them moving through the woods, their voices low, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then, the footsteps got closer. I closed my eyes, trying to stay still, trying not to make a sound. And then, nothing. Silence. I opened my eyes and looked around. The footsteps had stopped. The voices were gone. I waited, straining to hear something, anything. But there was only silence. I didn't move for what felt like hours. I just sat there, too scared to even breathe. Eventually, I heard a car door slam, and the engine started up again. I listened as it drove off, the sound fading into the distance. When I was sure they were gone, I got up and stumbled back to the road. My car was still there, the passenger door wide open. But the man was gone. I didn't waste any time. I got in, slammed the door, and drove as fast as I could until I reached the nearest town. I didn't stop until I was in a well-lit gas station, surrounded by people. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But I never picked up a hitchhiker again. And I never drive that road at night anymore. I had planned the hike for weeks. I needed to clear my head, to get away from everything for a bit. Work was stressful, my personal life was a mess, and I thought some time alone in nature would help me figure things out. I drove up to the trailhead early in the morning, packed my bag, and started walking. The trail was long and isolated, just how I liked it. No one else around, just the trees and the sound of my footsteps on the dirt path. The first few hours were peaceful. I didn't see a single person, not even a bird in the trees. The silence was calming. I had always liked being alone, and the woods felt safe in their quiet. After a while, I stopped for a break, found a flat rock to sit on, and took a drink from my water bottle. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, so quiet I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. A voice, far off in the distance, calling out for help. I stood up, listening carefully. There it was again. Someone was definitely calling out, but the sound was strange. It didn't echo the way I expected it to, like it was too muffled or too far away. I didn't know what to do. There was no cell service out here, and I couldn't just ignore someone who might be in trouble. I shouted back, "Hello? Where are you?" I waited, but there was no response. Just more of the same faint calling, like whoever it was couldn't hear me. I decided to leave the trail and head toward the voice. It felt wrong to leave someone out there, hurt or lost. The forest was thick, and the further I walked, the harder it got to navigate. The voice kept coming and going, like the person was moving. I tried to follow, but the trees seemed to close in around me. The more I walked, the more I felt like I was going in circles. After what felt like an hour, I finally saw him. He was sitting on the ground in a small clearing, leaning against a tree. He looked awful dirty, thin, his clothes torn. His face was gaunt, and his eyes were wide, like he hadn't seen another person in days. I approached slowly, unsure of what I was walking into. "Hey," I said. "Are you okay?" He looked up at me, blinking slowly, like he was trying to figure out if I was real. "Thank God," he said, his voice raspy. "I've been lost out here for weeks." I crouched down next to him, trying to get a better look. He didn't have a bag, no supplies, nothing. "How did you end up out here?" I asked. He shook his head. I don't even know. I went hiking with some friends, and we got separated. I've been trying to find my way back ever since. That didn't make sense. This area wasn't that remote. If he'd been lost for weeks, someone would have found him by now. There were search parties, helicopters, rangers. Where are your friends? I asked. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his eyes unfocused. I don't know. I don't remember. I started to feel uneasy. Something about him was off. The way he was talking, the way he kept looking around like he expected someone to jump out at us. We should get back to the trail, I said. I can help you find help, but we need to get moving. He didn't move. I can't, he said. They're still out here. I froze. Who? He shook his head again, his hand trembling as he rubbed his face. They're watching. They've been watching me the whole time. I thought I could get away, but they won't let me. My heart started to race. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just us. What are you talking about? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The people, he said, his voice barely a whisper now. The people in the woods. They don't want me to leave. I took a step back, suddenly feeling exposed. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else since I started the hike. The woods were supposed to be empty, but now I wasn't so sure. There's no one out here, I said. You're just disoriented. Come on, let's go. He shook his head again, more violently this time. You don't understand. They've been out here longer than me. They live out here. I can hear them at night. My stomach churned. I didn't know if he was hallucinating or if he was trying to mess with me, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. Look, we need to go, I said, more forcefully this time. I can't stay out here with you. He looked up at me then, his eyes wide and pleading. Please, he said. Don't leave me here. They'll take me again. I hesitated. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. Take you? I asked. What do you mean, take you? He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he just stared at me, his eyes filling with fear. He slowly lifted his arm and pointed behind me. I turned around, my heart pounding. But there was nothing there. Just trees, stretching out into the darkness. The silence was deafening. I turned back to him, but he had already stood up, his legs shaky, like he was getting ready to run. They're close, he whispered. We need to hide. Before I could say anything else, he took off into the trees. I stood there, stunned for a moment, unsure of what to do. Every instinct in me was screaming to leave, to get back to the trail and forget I ever saw him. But something made me follow. I ran after him, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks. The forest was dense, and it felt like the trees were closing in around me. I could hear him ahead of me, panting, crashing through the undergrowth, but I couldn't see him. The deeper I went, the darker it got. Suddenly, everything went silent. I stopped, my breath ragged, trying to listen. There was no sound. No footsteps, no rustling. Just silence. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. But there was nothing. I was alone. I turned around, trying to figure out which way I had come. Everything looked the same now, just trees and darkness. Panic started to creep in. I couldn't remember how far I had run, and I had no idea how to get back to the trail. I started walking, trying to retrace my steps, but every direction seemed wrong. My heart was racing, my hands trembling. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. And then, I saw it. A flash of movement just out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My mind was racing, my breath coming in short gasps. I felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me from all directions. I kept walking, faster now, desperate to find my way back. But every step I took only seemed to take me deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker, the darkness more oppressive. And then I heard it. A voice, faint but clear. Help. I froze. It wasn't the man's voice. It was something else. Something that sounded wrong, like it didn't belong in the woods. Help. It was closer now. I turned, but there was nothing. My heart was pounding in my chest. I wanted to run, but I didn't know where to go. I felt trapped, surrounded by something I couldn't see. The voice came again, closer still. Help. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground. My breath was coming in short, panic bursts. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew I needed to get away from it. And then I saw him. The man, standing just a few feet away from me, his face pale and twisted with fear. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me with those wide, empty eyes. I took a step back, my body trembling. What's happening? He didn't answer. He just raised his hand again, pointing behind me. I turned slowly, my stomach dropping. There, standing in the trees, was a figure. Tall, shadowy, just on the edge of the darkness. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I turned and ran, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from them. I ran until my lungs were on fire, until my legs gave up beneath me. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. I looked around, but the figure was gone. But I wasn't safe. I could feel it. I don't know how I made it back to the trail. I don't know how I found my way out of the woods. I had been traveling with Emily for over a week by the time she decided to visit the town. We had planned a long trip, mostly staying in small places, exploring local areas, keeping things low-key. The day she left for the nearby town, I stayed back at the little guest house we rented. It was more isolated than I expected, but we had been looking for quiet, so I didn't think much of it at first. She had texted me a few times when she got to the town, just simple things like what she was doing, places she was visiting, and how she thought it was charming. I didn't feel like going with her that day. I was tired from our earlier hikes, so I spent the day reading and resting, expecting her back by the evening. But that night, she didn't return. I texted her to check if everything was okay, and I didn't get a reply. At first, I figured she was just still enjoying herself. Maybe she met some people or got caught up exploring. I went to bed, thinking she'd come in later or early the next morning. The next morning came, and her bed was still untouched. I sent her more texts, just checking in, asking where she was. I called her phone, but it went to voicemail every time. That's when I started to feel uneasy. Emily wasn't the type to disappear like that. She always told me what she was doing. Even if she stayed out late, she would have let me know. I decided to head to the town myself, figuring I could find her or at least someone who saw her. It wasn't far, just a short drive through the countryside. The town was small, not many people around. I parked and started walking, stopping at the cafe she mentioned. The barista said they remembered her from the day before, but she hadn't been back since. I walked around the town for hours, asking shop owners, random people on the street, anyone who might have seen her. Some people remembered her, others didn't. But no one knew where she went. It was like she vanished after that. I went to the local police station, thinking they might be able to help. The officer at the front desk seemed disinterested, though. He took my information, asked a few basic questions, and told me they'd keep an eye out. But it didn't feel like enough. I left the station feeling more unsettled than before. Days passed, and there was still no sign of Emily. I stayed close to the guest house, hoping she'd show up or call. But nothing. I tried calling her phone again and again, leaving messages, but it never rang through. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about what might have happened to her, where she could be. On the third night after she went missing, I got a text from her phone. It was late, almost midnight. The message just said, "I'm fine. Be back soon." I should have felt relieved, but something about it felt wrong. The wording, the way it was phrased, it wasn't how Emily talked. I texted back right away, asking where she was and why she hadn't called. I didn't get a reply. I stared at the phone, waiting, feeling my heart pound in my chest. An hour passed, and then another message came. "Don't worry about me. Just stay where you are." The longer I stared at the message, the more unsettled I felt. Emily never spoke like that, not to me. She was always casual, friendly, full of little jokes or emojis in her texts. But these messages were stiff, too formal. I called her phone again, and it went straight to voicemail. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong. I tried to convince myself it was just her being weird, maybe playing a prank or trying to mess with me, but it didn't feel like that. I texted back, asking her again where she was. No response. The next morning, I drove back to the town, thinking maybe I could find her or at least figure out what was going on. I retraced the places she had been, the streets she mentioned in her earlier texts. But everything felt strange now. People in the town were colder, more distant. They seemed to avoid eye contact, barely answered when I asked questions. It was like they were shutting me out. I went back to the police station and told them about the texts, but the officer shrugged it off, saying if she was texting, she was probably fine. But she wasn't fine, I knew it. I could feel it in my gut. I left the station frustrated, unsure of what to do next. Later that day, I got another text. "Stop looking for me. Just go home." That wasn't Emily. I was sure of it now. The messages were getting stranger, more direct. I texted back, asking who this was, demanding they tell me where she was. Nothing. I spent that night pacing the room, my phone in my hand, waiting for another message. Just after midnight, it came. "You need to leave." I stared at the words on the screen, my heart pounding. I texted back, asking again where Emily was, who was sending these messages. But the reply that came a minute later made my blood run cold. "We know you're still here." I felt frozen in place, staring at the screen. Who was we? I ran to the window, looking out into the darkness, but there was nothing. No cars, no lights, just the empty road and the sound of the wind. I double-checked the door, making sure it was locked, then sat on the bed, gripping my phone, trying to think of what to do. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept hearing small noises outside the guest house, footsteps, whispers carried by the wind, but every time I looked, there was no one there. The messages kept coming, more frequent now. Each one felt more threatening, like whoever was sending them was watching me, getting closer. Leave now. You're not safe. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things, threw them in the car, and left the guest house without looking back. As I drove out of town, my phone buzzed one more time. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The message read, "You're next." I felt sick. I floored the gas pedal, desperate to get as far away as possible. I didn't stop driving for hours, not until I was back in a bigger town with other people around. I didn't know what to do. Emily was still missing, and I couldn't go back. I didn't know who was sending those messages, but I knew they weren't her. I went to the police in the new town, told them everything, showed them the texts. They promised to look into it, but they didn't seem to believe me. They said it was probably a misunderstanding, that Emily had just left, and someone was playing a sick joke. But I knew better. Something was wrong in that town, something that no one wanted to talk about. I still don't know what happened to Emily. Her phone stopped sending messages after that, and no one has seen her since. I've tried to move on, but the memory of those texts haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear my phone buzz. I grab it, half expecting to see another message. But there's nothing. Just silence. And that silence is almost worse. I was driving back from a job in the next town over when I saw her. It was getting dark, and I didn't really want to stop, but something about seeing a kid out there alone made me slow down. She was walking along the side of the road, just a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 10, maybe younger, and she wasn't dressed for the weather. I pulled over, rolled the window down, and called out to her. "Hey, are you lost?" She didn't answer at first. Just stood there, looking at me. Her clothes were dirty, and her hair was all tangled. I could see she wasn't crying or anything, which made it even stranger. Most kids lost like that would be crying or screaming. She just stared. I turned the car off and got out, walking over slowly. "You okay? Where are your parents?" I kept my voice calm. I didn't want to scare her. She looked at me, then glanced at the trees. That's when I noticed how still everything was. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just quiet. The girl finally spoke. "I don't know." Her voice was so soft, barely a whisper, like she was afraid to speak any louder. I was about to say something else when I realized she looked familiar. I couldn't place it right away, but I knew I'd seen her face before. Then it hit me. There was a girl who went missing around here 5 years ago. They put her face on posters, on the news. Everyone in town had been looking for her, but after a while, they all assumed the worst. And here she was, standing right in front of me, looking exactly the same as she had back then. I couldn't wrap my head around it. She hadn't aged a day. It didn't make any sense. My heart started pounding, and my hands felt clammy, but I couldn't just leave her there. I had to do something. "Let me take you to the police," I said, trying to sound normal. "They can help you." She didn't respond, just looked at me with those same blank eyes. I glanced around, wondering where she could have come from, and that's when I saw them. Just inside the tree line, maybe 50 feet away, were figures. At first, I thought it was just shadows, but no, it was people. They were standing there, almost hidden by the trees, but I could see them watching. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know who they were, but something about the way they stood there, so still, so silent, made me uneasy. I looked back at the girl. She didn't seem to notice them, or maybe she didn't care. "We need to go," I said, a little more urgently this time. "Come on, get in the car." She hesitated for a moment but then nodded slowly. I opened the passenger door, and she climbed in without a word. I kept glancing at the figures in the woods, but they hadn't moved. I didn't know what to do. My gut was screaming at me to get out of there, so I started the car and pulled back onto the road. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't stop thinking about those people in the woods. Who were they? Why were they watching? Who were those people? I asked her, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't answer right away, just stared out the window. After a long pause, she said, "They're always there." I glanced at her, trying to figure out what she meant. "What do you mean? Do you know them?" She shook her head, her face still expressionless. "They don't talk to me." That didn't make me feel any better. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I tried to think. Something was seriously wrong here. I needed to get help. I needed to get her somewhere safe. I took out my phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. It rang a few times before someone picked up. "Sheriff's Department," a gruff voice said. I found a kid," I stammered, glancing at the girl. "I think it's the girl who went missing a few years ago. I'm driving her to the station now." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then the sheriff's voice came back, slower this time. "You said you found her?" "Yeah," I said. "She's in my car right now." Another pause. "Where did you find her?" "Out by the old highway," I replied. "She was just walking alone." The sheriff's voice sounded different now, more serious. "You need to bring her here right away. Don't stop anywhere." I didn't like the way he said that. "What's going on?" I asked. "Just bring her in," he repeated. "And don't stop. We'll be waiting." I hung up, feeling even more uneasy. The girl still hadn't said anything else. She just sat there, staring out the window like she wasn't even there. I kept driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The people in the woods, the way the sheriff sounded. None of it made sense. As we got closer to town, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another car, but it stayed too far back, just barely visible. Whoever it was, they were following us. My pulse quickened, and I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just someone heading in the same direction. But the longer they stayed behind me, the more I started to panic. I sped up a little, but the car behind me did the same. My heart was racing now. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was following us was connected to the people I saw in the woods. "We're almost there," I told the girl, more to reassure myself than her. She didn't respond, just kept staring ahead. As we entered town, I saw the sheriff's station up ahead. Relief flooded over me, but it was short-lived. The car behind us sped up, closing the distance. I could see it now, a dark truck, old and beat up. It wasn't backing off. I pulled into the station's lot, my tires screeching as I came to a stop. The truck didn't follow me in but kept going down the road, disappearing into the night. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The sheriff came out to meet us, his face grim. He opened the passenger door and looked at the girl, then back at me. "Where did you say you found her?" he asked again, his voice low. "Out by the old highway," I repeated. She was just there. The sheriff nodded, but he didn't seem surprised. He looked back at the girl, who was still sitting silently, her eyes blank. "We've been looking for her for a long time," he said quietly. "But there's something you need to understand." I waited, my stomach churning. "She wasn't alone when she disappeared," he said, his eyes darkening. "And whoever took her, they're not done." I felt a cold chill run through me. I glanced at the girl, then back at the sheriff. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, another deputy came out of the station. "We need to get her inside," he said, glancing nervously at the road. The sheriff nodded, but I could tell he wasn't telling me everything. They escorted the girl inside, and I followed them, not knowing what else to do. As we walked into the station, I glanced back at the road, half expecting to see that truck again. But it was gone. Inside, the girl was taken into a back room, and the sheriff told me to wait. I sat in the lobby, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Hours passed, but no one came out to tell me anything. I kept replaying everything in my head: the girl, the people in the woods, the truck that followed us. Finally, the sheriff came back out. He looked tired, his face lined with worry. "What's going on?" I asked, standing up. He sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "We'll take it from here," he said, avoiding my question. "You should go home." "But what about the girl? What happened to her?" The sheriff shook his head. "It's better if you don't get involved." I opened my mouth to protest, but something in his eyes stopped me. He looked scared. I'd never seen him like that before. I left the station, my head spinning with questions. As I got into my car and drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about what the sheriff said. Whoever took her, they're not done. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside made me jump, every shadow made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching, waiting. And I didn't know if the girl was safe. Or if I was. I moved into the old farmhouse because it was cheap. Too cheap, really, but I was in a tight spot. I needed something quiet, away from the city, away from everything that had been weighing me down. The realtor barely asked any questions and was quick to hand over the keys, almost too quick, like she wanted to be done with it. But I didn't think much of it at the time. I was desperate for a fresh start, and this place seemed perfect for that. The house was old, but solid. It sat on a few acres of land, surrounded by fields and woods, no neighbors for miles. It was peaceful. At first, it felt like exactly what I needed. The creaks and groans of the house at night didn't bother me. I figured it was just a place settling, or maybe the wind moving through the trees outside. I liked the quiet. It was so different from what I was used to. It wasn't until I started unpacking that I found the first thing that gave me pause. Tucked behind a loose floorboard in the upstairs bedroom, I found a family photo. It was just lying there, as if someone had tried to hide it in a hurry. The picture showed a man, a woman, and two kids, a boy and a girl, both under 10. They were standing in front of the house, smiling. The odd thing was, the house didn't look as worn down in the picture. The paint wasn't peeling, and the windows weren't cracked. It looked well cared for. I turned the photo over, and written on the back in neat handwriting were the words, "The Thompsons, 2016. I wondered why the realtor hadn't mentioned the previous owners, but again, I didn't think too much about it. People move, families come and go. I put the photo aside and went back to unpacking. But over the next few days, the house started to feel different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I would catch myself glancing out the windows, half expecting to see someone standing in the yard, but no one was ever there. Then I found more of their things. It started with small stuff. A child's shoe in the back of a closet, a book of old family recipes shoved behind the fridge. But it was when I found the journal that things took a turn. The journal belonged to the mother, the woman from the photo. Her name was Sarah, and from the few entries I read, it seemed like they had been happy here, at least at first. She wrote about moving to the farmhouse to escape the noise of the city, about wanting a simpler life for their kids. But as I flipped through the pages, her writing changed. It became more erratic, more frantic. She started writing about strange things happening at night, sounds outside, shadows moving near the windows, and footsteps on the porch. One entry, dated just a few days before the journal abruptly ended, caught my attention. I hear them again. Every night, they come closer. Tom says it's just animals, but I know it's not. I don't think we're safe here. The kids are scared. We should leave, but Tom says we need to stay. I'm not sure we have a choice anymore. That was the last thing she wrote. After reading that, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong with the house, that maybe the Thompsons hadn't left by choice. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was just an overactive imagination, but the unease stuck with me. Every night, the house felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me, watching me. One night, about a week after I moved in, I heard it. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, on the porch outside. My heart raced, and I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The steps stopped, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I sat there in the dark, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen, but after what felt like an eternity, the silence returned. The next morning, I went outside to check, thinking maybe it was an animal, but the porch was empty. There were no footprints, no signs of anything unusual. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I decided to dig into the history of the house, to see if I could find out more about what happened to the Thompsons. I went into town and started asking around, but as soon as I mentioned the farmhouse, people climbed up. No one wanted to talk about it. They'd give me tight-lipped smiles and change the subject, or just walk away. It was like the place was cursed or something. Eventually, I made my way to the town library, hoping to find some old records. That's where I learned the truth. The Thompsons didn't move away. They vanished. One day, a neighbor came by to check on them, and the house was empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no note, nothing. The car was still in the driveway, and all their things were left behind. It was like they had just disappeared into thin air. The police investigated but came up with nothing. The case was eventually closed, and the house sat empty for years until I moved in. I couldn't believe it. The family in that photo, the ones whose belongings I had been finding all over the house, were just gone, and no one had any answers. It was like the whole town wanted to forget they ever existed. After that, the strange things happening in the house escalated. I started hearing voices at night, faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. The footsteps on the porch came back, and this time, they didn't stop. They circled the house, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around the perimeter, checking every window, every door. I was terrified, but I didn't know what to do. I tried calling the realtor, but she didn't answer. I even went back into town, hoping someone would finally tell me what was going on, but again, I was met with silence. It was like everyone knew something they weren't willing to share, and I was left in the dark. One night, the footsteps came again, but this time they didn't stay outside. I heard the front door creak open, even though I knew I had locked it. I was frozen in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps moved slowly through the house, getting closer and closer to the bedroom. I grabbed the baseball bat I had kept by the bed, convinced that whoever or whatever had taken the Thompsons had come back for me. I held my breath, waiting for the door to the bedroom to open, but it never did. Instead, the footsteps stopped just outside the door. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed, but nothing happened. Finally, after what felt like hours, the footsteps retreated, and I heard the front door close. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the bat, too scared to move. The next morning, I made up my mind. I had to leave. Whatever had happened to the Thompsons, I wasn't going to stick around and find out if the same thing was going to happen to me. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and got out of there. As I was driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw them, the Thompsons, standing in the yard, watching me leave. But when I looked again, there was no one there. Just the empty house, sitting in the middle of nowhere, holding on to its secrets. I never went back. I don't know what happened to that family, and I don't think I want to know. All I know is that something in that house wasn't right, and I'm just glad I got out when I did. I'd heard about the house from a guy at work. He said it had been empty for years. No one wanted to go near it, not even the town kids who liked to break into places for fun. The house wasn't too far out of the way, just off a road that connected a few small towns, so I figured I'd check it out. I wasn't the kind of guy who believed in ghosts or any of that. I just liked exploring old places, seeing what was left behind. It was a cold, gray afternoon when I went. The house stood alone, half hidden by trees that had grown wild around it. From the outside, it didn't look like much, just an old, two-story house with peeling paint and windows boarded up in places. I didn't think too much about it at first. It looked like every other abandoned house I'd seen. I parked my car down the road a bit, so no one would see it and think I was up to something. The place was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person around for miles. I didn't mind. It's part of what I liked about these trips. No one to bother you. The front door was locked, but the side door wasn't. It swung open with a groan, and I stepped inside. The air smelled musty, like mold and old wood. Dust covered everything. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved through the hallway. I found the living room first empty, except for an old chair and a broken table. The windows were boarded up, but there was just enough light coming in through the cracks for me to see. There were stairs leading to the second floor, but I didn't go up right away. I wanted to check out the ground floor first. The kitchen was in the back, with cabinets hanging open, some of the doors ripped off. There were no dishes, no food, just empty shelves and broken drawers. In the corner of the kitchen, I found a door that led down to the basement. It was dark, and the smell coming from down there was even worse than the rest of the house. I didn't go down. I'm not an idiot. Basements in places like this were never a good idea. So, I headed upstairs instead. The stairs creaked with every step, and for a second, I wondered if they'd give out under me. But they didn't, and soon enough, I was on the second floor. There were a few bedrooms up there, but most of them were empty, just old furniture, broken beds, and dusty floors. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I found the room. It was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and at first, it looked like the rest empty, run down. But then I saw the walls. They were covered in posters. Missing person posters. Dozens of them. Maybe more. I couldn't count. They were all taped or pinned to the walls, overlapping in some places, some faded with age. Each one had a face and a name, along with the town they were from. Most of the towns were nearby, within an hour or two of the house. Some of the posters were newer, the paper still crisp, while others looked like they'd been there for years, yellowed and brittle. I took a step closer to one of the posters. It was a woman's face, smiling in the photo, but the look in her eyes was unsettling. Beneath her photo were the words "missing, last seen in Avondale, 2015. I looked at another poster. A young boy, no older than 10, missing since 2018. They were all like that, people who had disappeared from the surrounding towns, people I'd never heard about. Something about it didn't sit right with me. These weren't just old posters that had been forgotten. They were placed here, in this room, like some kind of twisted collection. I stepped back, trying to take it all in, when I heard something. A soft creak, like a footstep, coming from somewhere in the house. My heart skipped. I hadn't seen anyone when I came in, hadn't heard anything until now. I stood still, listening, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old houses like this made noise all the time. But something in the back of my mind told me I wasn't alone. I decided to leave. I didn't need to see any more. This wasn't just some abandoned house. Something was wrong here. I moved quickly, heading back down the stairs, but as I reached the front hallway, I saw it. The front door, the one I tried and found locked, was open. Not wide open, just a crack, but enough for me to know someone else had been inside. My chest tightened. I wasn't alone. Someone had been in the house with me the whole time. I headed for the side door, the one I'd come in through, but when I got there, it was shut tight. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked from the outside. My stomach dropped. Whoever was here, they'd locked me in. I backed away from the door, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I didn't have a weapon, didn't have a way to defend myself. All I had was my phone, but when I pulled it out, there was no signal. Figures, out here in the middle of nowhere. I went back to the living room, trying to think of a way out. The windows were all boarded up, and even if I could pry one open, it would take too long. I had the sinking feeling that whoever was out there was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. That's when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, coming from outside the house, circling around, slow and deliberate. They stopped right outside the front door. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then the footsteps started up again, moving away from the door. I didn't wait to see where they were going. I bolted for the kitchen and tried the back door. Locked. Of course. I grabbed a chair and threw it at one of the boarded-up windows. The wood cracked, but didn't break. I hit it again, harder this time, and finally, the boards gave way. I climbed through the opening, scraping my hands on the splintered wood, and dropped down into the overgrown backyard. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if someone was watching me from the house. I just ran. I ran through the yard, through the trees, not stopping until I reached the road where I'd parked my car. My legs were burning, and my breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. But I managed to get the door open and started the engine. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away, back on the main road. I don't know who was in that house, or what they wanted, but I have a feeling they knew I'd seen the room, the posters. I don't know what they were planning to do, but I didn't stick around to find out. I never reported it. I didn't want to get involved. I just wanted to forget the whole thing, but I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see those faces on the walls. And I know, Whoever was in that house, they're still out there. I don't know why I went digging. I should have left it alone, but something about the way people were acting on the island didn't sit right with me. It all started when I was on vacation, taking a few weeks off work to get away from everything. I chose a small island, a place that wasn't crowded with tourists. The idea was to relax, maybe spend some time exploring the beaches, hiking, just to get a break from my everyday life. The island was beautiful. It was remote, and there weren't a lot of people. The locals seemed friendly at first, though they kept to themselves. I noticed that right away. They didn't seem too interested in talking to visitors, just doing their work and keeping out of sight. I figured they were just used to their quiet life and didn't want tourists disrupting things. I'd been there for about 3 days when I heard about the missing group. A couple of tourists had gone out on a boat trip and never came back. I overheard it from a couple staying at the same guest house as me. They said they'd seen the group the day before, all excited about going out on the water. Now, nobody knew where they were. I didn't think much of it at first. Accidents happen, right? Maybe the boat broke down, or they got lost. But the way the locals reacted when people started asking questions, it was strange. No one seemed worried. Not the guest house owners, not the people working at the restaurants, no one. It was like they didn't care. The authorities weren't any better. When the couple went to the local police, they came back frustrated. The police told them they were looking into it, but didn't seem too concerned. They said things like, people get lost out here all the time or they'll turn up. They didn't even send out a search boat right away. That's when I started feeling like something was wrong. I mean, even if it's common for people to get lost, shouldn't they be doing more? I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, after dinner, I took a walk down to the docks where the boat rentals were. The place was deserted, but I noticed a few of the boats were missing. I figured one of them must have been the one the tourists had taken. There were no signs of anyone around, no activity, nothing. I went back to my room, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going over what I'd seen, the way everyone was acting. It felt like there was something they weren't telling us, something they knew that they didn't want us to know. The next morning, I decided to ask around a bit more, just to see if anyone else had heard anything. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I went into one of the little shops near the beach, a small place where they sold handmade souvenirs. The woman behind the counter barely looked at me when I asked if she'd heard about the missing tourists. She shrugged and said something like, "It happens." That was it. No concern, no questions. Just like that. It happens. I started walking around town, keeping my ears open, but no one was talking about it. It was like the whole thing had been swept under the rug, like they wanted to pretend it never happened. That afternoon, I went back to the docks again. This time, there was a man there, an older guy with a thick beard, working on one of the boats. I asked him if he knew anything about the missing group. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me for a long time before finally saying, "They're gone. Leave it alone." That's when the pit in my stomach started to grow. The way he said it, like it was a warning. He didn't offer any more information, just went back to his work. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to process what he'd said. "They're gone. Leave it alone." I went back to my guest house and tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it, that maybe this sort of thing just happened out here. But then I overheard something later that night. One of the guests was talking to someone on the phone, and they mentioned other people who had gone missing on the island in the past. It wasn't just this group. There had been others, tourists mostly, who had disappeared and were never found. Now I was really starting to worry. I tried looking up information on my phone, but there wasn't much about the island. It wasn't a big tourist destination, so there weren't a lot of reports or news stories. But the few things I did find were unsettling. There were rumors online, people talking about how they'd heard of others going missing, how the island had a history of people vanishing without a trace. The next day, I decided to take a walk around the island, away from the main tourist spots. I figured maybe I'd find something, I don't know, some clue or at least get a better sense of the place. I walked for a few hours, following the dirt paths that led through the trees and along the coastline. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't see anyone else out there, no hikers, no locals, nothing. After a while, I came across a small clearing near the edge of the island, where the trees opened up to a view of the water. That's where I found it, a pile of old, weathered belongings. Backpacks, shoes, clothes, all piled up in a heap. Some of the stuff looked like it had been there for a while, faded and torn, but some of it looked newer, like it hadn't been there long. I felt sick. These weren't just random things. They belonged to people. People who had gone missing. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out at me, but there was no one. Just the sound of the wind and the waves in the distance. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, and I felt like I needed to get out of there. I started to back away when I heard something. Footsteps. I froze. They were coming from the trees behind me, slow and deliberate. I didn't wait to see who it was. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the ground as I pushed through the trees, branches scratching at my arms and face. I didn't stop until I was back at the main road. By the time I reached my guest house, I was out of breath, my clothes soaked with sweat. I went straight to my room, locked the door, and tried to calm myself down. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, following me. And now they knew I'd seen the pile. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, footsteps, the sound of someone moving around. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I wasn't safe here. The next morning, I packed my bags and left the guest house without telling anyone. I went straight to the ferry dock, but when I got there, the ferry wasn't running. They told me there was some kind of issue, that the next ferry wouldn't be for another 2 days. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay on the island, not after what I'd seen, but I didn't have a choice. I went to a different guest house, hoping that maybe I'd be safer there, that whoever had been watching me wouldn't know where I was. But that night, the noises started again. Footsteps outside my window, voices in the distance. I didn't dare look outside. I stayed in bed, clutching my phone, praying for the ferry to come. The next morning, I went down to the dock again. The ferry was there, thank God. I didn't waste any time. I bought my ticket and got on board, not looking back at the island. As the ferry pulled away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I don't know what's happening on that island, but I know one thing for sure, people are disappearing, and the locals know more than they're letting on. I don't think they're involved, not directly, but they're hiding something. They don't want outsiders digging too deep, asking too many questions. I've thought about going to the authorities, telling them what I saw, but I don't think it would do any good. No one would believe me. They'd say I was imagining things, that it was just a coincidence, that the island was perfectly safe. But I know the truth. Something is wrong on that island, and I'm just glad I got out when I did. I decided to go hiking alone to clear my head. Work had been tough, and I needed some time away. I picked a trail in the mountains that wasn't too crowded. The weather was nice, and the path looked easy. I took my backpack with water, some snacks, and a map. I planned to be gone for a day or two, nothing more. After a few hours on the trail, I found a part that was less maintained. The trees were thick, and birds were singing all around. I felt calm walking through the woods. The sounds of the forest were soothing. As I walked, I saw a small cabin off the main path. It looked old, with wood that was worn and a chimney that wasn't used anymore. Smoke was coming from the chimney, which was strange for such a remote place. Curious, I approached the cabin. I parked my backpack and walked closer. The door was slightly open, so I knocked gently. An elderly man opened the door. He looked older than I thought, with a gray beard and tired eyes. He welcomed me inside without asking questions. The cabin was small, with a simple table, a couple of chairs, and a wood stove. It smelled like old wood and something else I couldn't identify. He introduced himself as Jack, a retired park ranger. He said he had lived here for years, watching over the forest and helping hikers when needed. He seemed kind but distant. I felt a bit uneasy but didn't say anything. We sat down, and he offered me some tea. I accepted, grateful for the hospitality. As we talked, I noticed gaps in his stories. He said he had been a ranger for over 30 years, but when I asked about his family, he couldn't remember much. He mentioned having children, but the details were vague. Sometimes, he would pause and look away, trying to recall something. I told him about my hike and how I needed to clear my mind. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally. After a while, he stood up and said he needed to check something outside. I watched him go to the back of the cabin and noticed he left the door slightly open again. I started to feel uneasy. It was late afternoon, and I had been sitting there for hours. I asked if I could stay the night, but he seemed hesitant. He said it was late and that I should probably head back. I insisted, saying I could stay for a few more minutes. He finally agreed, but his eyes seemed distant. I looked around the cabin more carefully. There were old photos on the wall, but they were faded and hard to see. I saw pictures of a man in a ranger uniform, and some with families, but the faces were blurry. One photo showed a group of hikers, but it was too old to make out who they were. As evening approached, the light outside faded and the temperature dropped. I decided to leave before dark. I thanked Jack for the tea and stood up to go. He seemed to regain some of his composure and smiled, telling me to be safe on the trail. I walked towards the door, but it was harder to open than before. I pushed, and it creaked loudly. Inside, it was dark, and I felt like something was wrong. I hurried to the back door, thinking it might be easier to exit that way. But as I reached for the handle, Jack was standing there. He looked angry now, his face hard. He said I shouldn't have come here, that it was dangerous. I tried to stay calm, explaining I just wanted to leave, but he wouldn't listen. He started to speak quickly, words not making much sense. I realized he was agitated, maybe scared. I backed away, trying to find another way out. The cabin seemed smaller now, the walls closing in. I saw a window and tried to open it, but it was stuck. Jack moved towards me, his eyes wild. I knew I had to get out before he did something. I grabbed my backpack and ran to the door, pushing past him. He grabbed my arm, pulling me back, but I managed to break free and sprint outside. The forest was dark, and I didn't know which way to go. I ran through the trees, branches hitting my face and cutting my arms. My heart pounded as I tried to find the trail again. I didn't stop running until I saw the main path ahead. I followed it quickly, not looking back. The sounds of Jack's footsteps were behind me, getting closer. I kept running, ignoring the pain from my cuts. Finally, I reached a clearing where I could see the trail clearly. I followed it until I reached a familiar spot. The trail led me back to the main road, where I found my car. It was dark now, and I got in, locking the doors. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I was far from the cabin. My hands were shaking, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I looked back in my mind at what had happened. Jack said he was a park ranger, but something about his story didn't fit. His memory was unclear, and his behavior was strange. When I ran, I felt like he knew I discovered something, like he had secrets he couldn't share. I didn't tell anyone about the cabin or Jack. I just kept to myself, trying to forget what happened. But sometimes, I still think about that cabin and the old man who didn't seem to belong. I'm glad I got out alive, but the memory still haunts me. I never went back to that trail, and I hope no one else does either. The island is beautiful, but it's hiding something dark. I just want to move on, but I can't shake the feeling that something was watching me that day. In the end, I made it home safe, but I knew I had narrowly escaped something bad. I still don't know what Jack was really doing there or why he reacted the way he did. All I know is that I was lucky to get out when I did. And that's my story. I stayed at this rundown motel on the edge of town because it was cheap, and I had a tight budget. It was supposed to be a quick stopover on my way to a job interview in the city. When I arrived, the place was eerily quiet. The only thing I could hear was the distant hum of a neon sign flickering outside. The motel had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and the parking lot was nearly empty. The owner, a middle-aged man with a grizzled beard and a permanent scowl, handed me the key to my room with a curt nod. I tried to make small talk, but he wasn't much for conversation. I shrugged it off and headed to my room, which was just as grimy as the rest of the place. The first night went by uneventfully. The bed was uncomfortable, but I was too tired to care. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The parking lot had a few more cars than the night before, but there were no people around. I saw some rooms had their doors slightly ajar, which struck me as odd. I decided to check it out. In one of the rooms, the bed was perfectly made, but there was a half-eaten sandwich on the nightstand, with a few bite marks still visible. The TV was on, but the volume was turned down low. I thought it was just someone being careless, but it struck me as weird. I went to the front desk to ask the owner if anyone was staying in those rooms. He said they had checked out and seemed annoyed by the question. I let it slide and went back to my room. The place felt more unsettling with each passing minute. Later that night, I noticed something even stranger. The room across the hall had its door wide open, with no one inside. A few personal items were scattered around: a pair of women's shoes, a book, and some clothing. It was as if the person had left in a hurry. I thought about calling the police but hesitated, thinking it might just be another case of a careless guest. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease. I went to the local diner for breakfast. The waitress there mentioned that the motel had a high turnover rate and that it was known for some odd disappearances over the years. She didn't go into detail, but it made me more uncomfortable. That afternoon, I decided to investigate further. I checked out a few more rooms. In one, I found a suitcase with the name tag of a guest who had been reported missing. It was packed with clothes, but the ID in the suitcase was gone. I also found a room with a broken window. The bed was rumpled as if someone had left in a hurry. I took photos of everything and went back to the front desk. I confronted the owner about what I'd seen. He became visibly angry and told me to mind my own business. I felt a growing sense of dread. The missing persons, the strange behavior of the owner, and the odd things I had found seemed connected. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard muffled noises outside my room. It sounded like someone was moving around and whispering. I peeked through the peephole and saw the owner talking to someone in the hallway. I couldn't make out the conversation, but the other person looked nervous and kept glancing around. I decided to pack my things and leave, but when I reached the parking lot, my car was blocked by a large van. I could see a few people inside, but they were obscured by the tinted windows. My heart raced. I went back to my room and tried to stay calm. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to make a run for it. I managed to slip out of the motel unnoticed. As I was leaving, I saw the van drive off, but it had no license plate. I called the police from a payphone and told them everything I knew. They promised to send someone out to investigate. When I finally made it to my interview, I was shaken but relieved. I never heard what happened at the motel after that. I assume the police found something since the place was shut down a few weeks later. I still think about those people who went missing and hope they were found and that justice was served. I learned a valuable lesson from that experience. Never ignore your gut feelings and always trust your instincts when something feels off. I still remember the day perfectly, even though it feels like it happened a lifetime ago. I had been volunteering at a local shelter, helping out with whatever tasks needed doing. The place was small, just a few rooms set up to help people in tough situations. One afternoon, while sorting through some donations, a woman rushed in with a child. The boy couldn't have been older than 10. He was disheveled and looked frightened. The woman, who I later learned was his mother, was in tears. She kept repeating that her son had come back after being missing for years. At first, it didn't sink in. I remember seeing the boy's face, pale and tired, and thinking about how strange it was to see someone so young looking so broken. The shelter staff immediately contacted the authorities. I overheard bits of the conversation. The boy had disappeared when he was just 5, and his taste had gone cold. There were no leads, no evidence, nothing. And now, here he was, right in front of us, but something felt off. While the authorities were taking statements and arranging medical checks, I took it upon myself to help. I tried to speak with the boy, to make him feel more comfortable. He told me his name was Jamie, and he seemed to be in a daze, like he was still trying to wake up from a bad dream. As the days passed, I noticed that Jamie wasn't the same as before. He would flinch at sudden noises, and he had a habit of staring at the walls for long periods. He barely spoke and wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. It was like he was in his own world. Something in me couldn't let it go. I started to ask questions, talk to people who might have seen Jamie before he went missing. I reached out to his old school teachers, anyone who might remember him. Everyone said the same thing. Jamie was a sweet, shy kid. There were no signs of trouble or trauma. They remembered his disappearance as a mystery that left the whole town unsettled. I also dug into the reports. They were sparse, just the usual details about his last known whereabouts, a description of his clothes, and the fact that he vanished without a trace. But one thing stood out. The last reported sighting was near an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It was a place where no one went anymore, just a rundown structure with a bad reputation. I decided to check it out. I didn't have much hope of finding anything, but curiosity got the better of me. I went to the house one afternoon. It was as decrepit as you'd imagine. The windows were broken, and the yard was overgrown. Inside, the place was filled with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. In one of the back rooms, I found something odd. There were strange marks on the floor, like something had been dragged. Next to them was an old diary, its pages yellowed and torn. I started reading through it, and my heart sank as I realized it belonged to Jamie. The diary entries were written in a shaky hand, but they were clear enough to understand. The entries described being locked in a room, hearing voices, and being fed only scraps. It was chilling to read, and it painted a grim picture of Jamie's life during those missing years. I took the diary to the authorities, but they were skeptical at first. They said it could be anything, possibly someone else's diary left behind. I kept pressing, and eventually, they agreed to investigate the house. A few days later, they returned with grim news. They found evidence that someone had been living in that house recently. They discovered a small stash of food, clothes, and other personal items that matched Jamie's descriptions. They also found a hidden compartment with old photographs, some of which showed Jamie with a man who wasn't his father. The investigation turned into a media frenzy, and while the police were handling it, I continued to help Jamie's family. Despite the turmoil, Jamie was slowly adapting back to life at home. He started talking more, and the flinching lessened, but the scars, both physical and mental, remained. Jamie's return brought a sense of relief but also raised more questions than answers. No one knew exactly what had happened, and the man in the photographs was never found. It was a case that left many loose ends. Jamie did eventually return to a semblance of normal life, but he never spoke much about those missing years. The diary and the house were a grim reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. It was a hard lesson in how quickly something can seem normal and how easily something can be concealed beneath the surface. It started when I saw a flyer on a bulletin board in a coffee shop. It was about a group protesting missing persons cases in the city. They were meeting at a small community center every week. At first, I didn't think much of it. Missing persons cases were tragic but common. Still, something about the flyer caught my attention, so I decided to check it out. I went to their meeting one evening. The group was small but passionate. They spoke about a series of disappearances that had plagued the city over the past few years. The cases were all unsolved, and the group felt like there was more to the story. I listened and watched, feeling both curious and uneasy. The group's leader, a woman named Clara, was particularly intense. She spoke with conviction about a shadowy organization that was supposedly behind the disappearances. I had a background in investigative journalism, so I decided to look into it further. I thought if there was even a small chance that Clara's claims were true, it was worth investigating. I started by contacting the families of the missing people. Most were willing to talk and seemed to believe in the group's theories, but their stories were fragmented and sometimes contradictory. The deeper I dug, the stranger things got. I found inconsistencies in the official records, things that didn't quite add up. For instance, some of the missing persons had been reported to have left the city, but family members swore they had never left. I decided to visit some of the places where these people were last seen. One of the locations was a rundown warehouse near the outskirts of the city. It was abandoned, but I noticed fresh tire tracks leading to the back. I tried to get in, but the door was locked tight. The area was desolate, and I didn't see anyone around. I took some photos of the place and made notes. I was starting to feel like I was getting closer to something significant. A few days later, I received a strange phone call. The voice on the other end was muffled, and the person spoke in a hushed tone. They told me to stop digging into the disappearances and warned me that I was getting too close to the truth. I was shaken but determined not to back down. I continued my investigation, focusing on the links between the missing persons and the supposed organization. I found a pattern in the places where people went missing. They all had some connection to high-profile, wealthy individuals. It seemed like these people might be involved in something far darker. One night, I went to meet Clara and the group for another protest. When I arrived, the room was strangely quiet. Clara was not there, and the group members were acting nervous and evasive. I could feel something was off. After a while, a man I hadn't seen before approached me. He introduced himself as Mark and said he had some information about the missing persons cases. Mark took me to a different location, a seemingly normal office building. Inside, he showed me a series of documents and photographs that were not available to the public. They detailed meetings between high-ranking officials and private security firms. The documents suggested that the disappearances were part of a larger scheme involving human trafficking. As I was reviewing the materials, I noticed that Mark seemed too calm, almost too perfect. Something felt off. I asked him about his connection to Clara and the group, but he avoided answering directly. I started to suspect that he might be part of the very organization we were trying to expose. When I left the office building, I had a sinking feeling that I was being followed. I kept checking my rearview mirror and took an indirect route back to my apartment. I saw a dark-colored car tailing me, but whenever I tried to get a good look, it would pull back. That night, I went through the documents Mark had given me and found more alarming information. The organization seemed to have connections to powerful figures in the city, and there were references to clearing up loose ends. I knew I needed to get this information to the authorities, but I was scared. I decided to go to the police with what I had. When I arrived, I tried to explain everything to an officer. He listened but didn't seem to take me seriously. After a while, he told me that they would look into it, but I got the impression that he wasn't fully committed. Feeling frustrated, I contacted a few trusted friends and shared what I had learned. They helped me spread the information discreetly. It wasn't long before media outlets picked up the story, and the public started to take notice. The pressure on the authorities increased. Eventually, the investigation into the disappearances gained traction. Several people from the organization were arrested, and many of the missing persons were found alive, though some had been trafficked. The whole experience was harrowing, and it took a toll on me. But knowing that I had contributed to exposing the truth helped me find some peace. I moved away from the city shortly after. The stress and fear of being followed were too much. I've since kept a low profile and avoided any more investigations. The case has been largely resolved, but the memory of those days still lingers. I had been searching for my brother for years. He had disappeared without a trace, and despite every effort, I had found nothing. No leads, no signs, just an endless void where he used to be. It was the kind of situation that gnawed at you, day after day, making you question every decision you'd ever made. Then, one day, out of the blue, I received a phone call. The caller ID showed an unknown number. I answered, and a voice on the other end, hoarse and trembling, said, "It's me." My heart skipped a beat. It was him. I asked him where he was, but he didn't say much. Just that we needed to meet and that it had to be soon. I agreed without hesitation. We arranged to meet at a park we used to visit together. It felt like a place we both shared, and I hoped it might offer some familiarity. When the day came, I arrived early. The park was quiet, with only a few joggers and people walking their dogs. I waited near a bench under a large oak tree. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. My hands were shaking as I held onto my phone, checking it repeatedly, hoping for a text or a call. Eventually, I saw him approaching. My brother looked like a shadow of the person I remembered. He was gaunt, his clothes hung off him in a way that made him seem even more emaciated. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around nervously. As he got closer, I could see the fear etched into his features. It was like he was scared of everything and nothing all at once. When we finally came face to face, I tried to hug him, but he flinched away. "We need to be careful," he whispered, glancing around the park as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. His voice was barely more than a rasp. I tried to get him to talk, but he was reluctant. He kept looking over his shoulder and mumbling about being followed. I asked him what had happened, why he had disappeared, but his answers were disjointed and confusing. He spoke about being watched, about people who wanted him to stay hidden. It was hard to make sense of his fragmented words. We decided to walk, hoping the movement might help him relax a bit. As we walked through the park, I noticed he seemed constantly on edge. He kept glancing behind us, and his pace quickened whenever someone walked too close. I felt a growing sense of dread. Something was clearly very wrong. At one point, he stopped and pulled me to the side, into a more secluded area of the park. "They're still out there," he said. "I can feel them watching." His voice shook as he spoke. "I can't stay here long. They'll find us." I tried to calm him down, telling him that we needed to go somewhere safe. We walked to my car, and I drove us to a small cafe that was open 24 hours. I hoped the public setting would make him feel safer. Inside, we found a booth in a corner, and he finally began to relax a little. He looked around the cafe, still nervous, but less frantic than before. Over coffee, he began to share some of what had happened. He told me that he had been hiding from a group of people who were involved in some dangerous activities. He didn't go into details, but from what I gathered, he had stumbled into something that made him a target. The fear in his eyes made it clear that he was still terrified. We talked for hours. I tried to get as much information as I could, but he remained vague about the specifics. I could tell that he was deeply traumatized, and every mention of his past seemed to cause him physical pain. It was heartbreaking to see him like this, so changed from the person I once knew. As the night went on, I began to worry about our safety. His fear seemed almost contagious, and I started to feel the weight of his paranoia. I decided it was best to get him to a secure location where we could figure out our next steps. I drove us to a hotel that was in a quieter part of town. At the hotel, I made sure we had a room on the second floor with a view of the parking lot. I didn't want anyone sneaking up on us. My brother seemed to relax a little once we were inside. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and he fell asleep almost as soon as he hit the bed. I stayed up, watching over him and making sure everything seemed all right outside. The whole experience had left me on edge, but I was relieved that at least my brother was safe for the moment. We would need to figure out our next steps in the morning. I planned to contact the authorities and get him the help he needed. But for now, I was just grateful that we had found each other again and that he was out of immediate danger.